Most of the time, when writing a video, I try to limit myself to just the relevant parts of whatever it is I'm talking about. If I am writing an essay, I don't need to exhaustively cover every detail of whatever it is I'm talking about, and moreover, my arguments would be weaker were I to do that. Full Metal Bazinga, the point was to be exhaustive. The point was to explain it. It's different. But sometimes you rewatch a show that you've liked since you were 14 and take 34 pages of notes, which then turns into 36,000 words of script, which just will not condense down into anything remotely focused on a central thesis. So this is not a video essay. This is a lecture. Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Superpowered Delinquency, an examination and discussion of the television show Misfits. Misfits was created by Howard Overman and ran from 2009 to 2013 on E4 in the UK. In addition to creating the show, Overman also wrote the majority of the episodes throughout the show's run, although 6, 2 per season from season 3 to 5, were written by John Brown, with the story credit for Brown's episode in season 3 going to both Brown and Overman. Our discussion will feature occasional mentions of the last 2 seasons, but for the most part we'll be limiting our scope to seasons 1 to 3, for reasons that can be pretty neatly summarized by Wikipedia's chart of the main cast throughout the show. The reading for this course will include Misfits seasons 1 to 3, as well as the transmedia web content for the show in the form of webisodes and in-character social media accounts. While none of the reading is strictly required, watching the 20 canon episodes in seasons 1 to 3 is recommended, and engaging with the transmedia storytelling is optional but interesting. Season 3, episode 4 is omitted from the reading list as it is not canon in any estimation of the show, which values adherence to clearly established time travel rules. The course will consist of 13 lectures grouped into 5 units, compiled in a single, disastrously long video for your convenience. There will be no assignments, tests, or exams, however I will accept and review essays and other responses submitted in the comments below. Unit 1 will begin in our second full lecture, but for our first, we'll need to cover some important background information in the form of an in-depth look at the timeline. Lesson 0. The timeline. So, this is going to become the timeline for seasons 1 to 3. Currently, it's just some calendars, but we'll get there. Season 1 and 2 cover from July 29th, 2009 to September 18th, 2009. We know this because we know for a fact that the Christmas special takes place in late December of 2009. We don't know the exact days, but that gives us a starting point. We also know that the end of their community service happens 3 months prior to the Christmas special, so that gives us September. From there, we know that each episode takes about a week. Some don't take the full week, though, and we know this because we are me, and I have gone through all the episodes and taken detailed notes on how many days each of them cover. In episode 2, there is a full moon, and we can use that to place the start of the show. In 2009, there was a full moon on July 7th, so the week of the 6th is the week that episode 2 takes place, and from there, we can build outward to place the episodes in the rest of Season 1 and Season 2. Season 2, Episode 1 picks up the week after the end of Episode 6 of Season 1, like only a weekend has passed. There is a contradiction to these dates as proposed in the web episode version of Nathan's Memorial that we see Kelly watch in the show, because the full version was released online, and at the end it gives Nathan's birthday as March 15th and his death date as in December of 2009, the air date of the last episode, actually. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense because we know that only a weekend passes between the end of Season 1, Episode 6, and Season 2, Episode 1. It's explicitly mentioned in the web episode Locker Inspection and implied by everything else about the way that things are talked about in Season 2, Episode 1. And then we know how much time passes between Season 2, Episode 1 and the end of their community service, and we know that there's 3 months from the end of their community service to December, so he can't possibly have died in December 2009. That was clearly a misstep on the editor's part, and I am disregarding that. I'm also going to disregard that birthday for Nathan, because the web episode Birthday Boy has him celebrating his birthday, and that would be set either August 20th or 21st, probably. So, like, he's probably not born March 15th. Or if he is, he's not celebrating his birthday in Birthday Boy. Unclear. So, I have gone ahead and placed the approximate placements of the episodes in the first 2 seasons. Season 3 is a little bit harder to place chronologically. However, we can work backward from the fact that we get the year anniversary of the storm in Season 5. Using that, and assuming that Seasons 4 and 5 conform to the 1 week per episode model established for the show, that places the start date for episode 3 between January 4th and February 1st. Obviously, that's a pretty big range. However, we can narrow it down a little more by taking into account that between the Christmas special and Season 3, there's enough time for Simon, Alisha, Nathan, and Marnie to all go to Vegas, and that between Seasons 3 and 4, there's enough time for Seth and Kelly to go to some unnamed African country, and for Kelly to decide that she wants to stay there. This means that I've decided to place the start date of Season 3 as January 18th. For this first week, the main group is not in community service, just Rudy is, and then for the second week, they join him, and he mentions that they are sentenced to 7 weeks of community service. We only see 6 of those, assuming that the last scene of Episode 1 takes place the Monday of their first week of community service. That's including the week that would be Season 3, Episode 4, by the way. Episodes 6 and 7 of Season 3 both take place the week of the 21st to 26th. Season 3, Episode 6 ends, and then Season 3, Episode 7 picks up immediately, and there's no, like, time jump within either episode of any significant period of time watching them. So, with that, we have the rough episode placement for Season 3 up. This places the end of Season 3 at about March 3rd. It could be March 4th or 5th. As mentioned, there is that week that we just don't see of their community service after Simon travels back to the past at the end of the show. Presumably Kelly completes it before she leaves on her trip with Seth, but maybe not. I don't know why Curtis and Rudy are still in community service at the start of Season 4. I guess Rudy could have gotten a longer sentence given that he's already in community service when the group starts, but Curtis... I didn't rewatch Season 4 and 5 for this video, so maybe they get resentenced and it's explained there, or maybe they just didn't count the weeks that they were doing it without a probation worker. I don't know. Honestly, Season 3 and onward get a lot harder to specify what the timeline of things is, and they get a lot lazier about their time travel. Segue. This, which you for sure cannot see in any detail, is a timeline covering December 2008 to March of 2010, showing all of the time travel in the show. I've marked any instances that Curtis loops something with a little tick mark of blue highlighter, and any time that there is a significant gap between the triggering event for his using his power and the time that he is redoing with his power, I've given him a pen line showing his travel. This blue highlighter line is Simon's time travel, coming from early March of 2010 to early August of 2009, and then he lives through the next couple weeks until dying back in the past, during which time I refer to him as Future Simon because there are 2 Simons running around, which brings us to the difference between how Curtis's time travel works and how Simon's time travel works. Simon's time travel, when he eventually gets the power to do so, is physically traveling back in time. There are 2 of him, and it is an immutable timeline. He cannot change the events of the past, he can only confirm what has already happened. Curtis is still dealing with single timeline rather than branching timeline, but he is dealing with a mutable timeline, and for him, he is not physically traveling back into the past, it's merely information that is traveling. He is rewinding time, and he is only able to occupy the body of his past self in the position that his past self was at the moment he is returning to. So he rewinds time a couple minutes to undo Kelly's death in episode 1, and he's standing where he was a couple minutes ago in that body with the knowledge that Kelly is about to be attacked and killed. He goes back from July of 2009 to December of 2008, and he is just in his body where he was at that time, unlike Simon, where there are 2 of him. Is that clear? Traveling back in time, there are 2 Simons, present Simon and future Simon. Rewinding time, there's 1 Curtis. He's just where he was in the past. Curtis's power is very clearly established over the course of Season 1, and used consistently, only working the one way from Season 1 until the Christmas special in Season 2, when he sells it. It is the reason that the Nazi episode, Season 3, Episode 4, is not canon. Curtis sells his power to Seth, who then sells it to an old man who wants to go back in time and kill Hitler. This old man is Jewish, he was alive during World War II, so theoretically, he could use the power to rewind time to being himself in the past, and as a young boy, go off on this quest. That is not what happens. Instead, an elderly gentleman standing in England in 2010 is transported back in time to Hitler's study in Germany, but still as an old man. Rather than rewinding time to his past self, where there's only 1 of him in the past, he somehow has the power that Simon had now to just jump back in time, which is not how Curtis's power works. However, it does still allow for mutable time travel, and his actions in the past lead to a different present when he returns to the present. They've forgotten how Curtis's power works. They've picked and chosen from the 2 different powers they've established, and it's not like they're establishing a third new power, which they could do, and I would be fine with, because the laws of the universe in which Misfits exists allows for different types of time travel via different powers. Moreover, at the end of the episode, the power ends up in Kelly, who also uses it to travel back to Nazi Germany to confront Hitler. She shouldn't be able to do that. She should be limited to the time in which she was alive. She shouldn't be able to travel back past her own birth if she's using Curtis's power. But she is. Okay, fine. You've broken the rules for this episode, and this is why it's not canon, but I will accept the rules once broken for their own internal logic. However, they then break the new rules they've established even more by having Kelly, who returns to the present, remember the events of the show that we've seen. Like, she doesn't just remember the alternate version of things that she lived through. She doesn't just remember, growing up as a child in a Britain run by the Nazis. She remembers all of this. How? How is that the case? How does she remember both? That's not how either power has ever worked. Is she magic now? The Nazi episode is not canon. Howard Overman, meet me in the fucking pit. Unit 1, Character Development. Lesson 1, Premise. The premise of Misfits is fairly straightforward. A group of young offenders in community service develop superpowers after getting caught in a freak storm. It is also the primary reason I have excluded Seasons 4 and 5 from the scope of this discussion, because the approach the show takes to that premise changes over time, even if the premise itself does not. Really, the shift happens after Season 2, facilitated by the Christmas special, but it's more obvious in Seasons 4 and 5, and combined with the turnover in the main cast, it makes Misfits kind of feel like 2 shows of 3 and 2 seasons respectively that just happen to be set in the same universe. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Implicit to the premise is that the powers our main characters develop, and those developed by the other people caught in the storm, all come from some aspect of their personalities. generally with a downside. Kelly's insecurities mean that she can hear other people's thoughts, particularly when they're about her. Curtis is filled with regret about where he is in life, so when something happens that he regrets, he can rewind time. Nathan has no real regard for consequences or his own mortality, so he's immortal. Simon feels overlooked, excluded, and ignored by his peers, and this manifests in turning invisible. Alisha's power is less easily summarized, but it does fit the trend, and we'll be covering it in more detail later. For the first 2 seasons of the show, the powers themselves, their downsides, and how the characters respond to having powers at all serve to spur character development for our 5 main characters to varying degrees. This is accomplished quite effectively and largely without drawing too much attention to itself. It's very obvious, to the point that explaining it feels unnecessary, but the characters never explicitly discuss it. The Christmas special, which serves as the final episode of Season 2, marks a turning point. It introduces Seth, who has the power to take other people's powers and redistribute the ones that he's taken, and this allows for the show to do its own take on the superhero trope of giving up your powers only to have something happen that makes you realize how much you needed them. When this happens in the Christmas special, the whole point is that Kelly, Curtis, and Nathan realize the utility of the specific powers they had before and why those powers were positive parts of their lives. And then they buy all new powers. From a Watsonian perspective, considering character motivations, this doesn't totally make sense. Of the 5, Curtis and Alisha are the only ones who cannot buy their old powers, as Seth has already sold them, and Alisha is the only one whose power was only ever negative, and who therefore has no reason to want it back, even if she could get it. But the whole point of Nathan and Kelly's realizations is that their powers have value, not that having a power generally is a positive for their lives.
Having the power could have stopped it.
If I die, I won't be there for Marnie and the baby.
If Nathan and Kelly's original powers were still available, there isn't a clear character reason why they choose something else, and Simon never wanted to sell his power in the first place and got a lot of use out of learning how to control it. However, if we step back and treat powers as a method of character development, the choice to change which powers the characters have is understandable. Most of these characters are not in the same places that they were when they got their powers, and it would be interesting to have that reflected in new powers. But rather than do that, Overman just seems to have gone with new powers that could lead to some interesting stories or give our characters ways to solve problems they encounter moving forward. And this is what I mean when I say that the approach to the show's premise changes. Choosing abilities for your superpowered characters based on what would lead to interesting story events or be useful to help get them out of scrapes is a perfectly fine approach to writing a superhero story. It works. But it is a decidedly different approach than that established in the first 2 seasons of the show. The function of powers in the narrative has changed, and when the new characters introduced in seasons 4 and 5 get character development, it no longer happens directly in response to their power. The other half of the premise of 5 people in community service getting superpowers is the community service part, and the place that holds in the show shifts as well, though not as much. Basically, Misfits' whole thing is that these people are not heroic, and that superpowers aren't all they're cracked up to be, and a big part of that is that these 5 people are discounted by the world around them due to being in community service. Their community service is also just a way to get all our characters in the same place and give them a reason to interact, and as such there are a lot of plot lines that don't have all that much to do with community service specifically and just kind of use either it or the community center generally as a jumping off point. In Season 1, even in episodes like that, the fact that the gang's all in community service is still relevant, either for plot reasons or character dynamics between our main characters and the other people they meet. Plus, the overarching plot of the season hinges on the group being in community service, as Sally wouldn't be as suspicious of their possible involvement in Tony's death were it not for the fact that they're young offenders, and she wouldn't be able to do most of what she does if she weren't their probation worker. I would argue that in the case of every episode and plotline in Season 1, you cannot remove the characters from community service without the story being substantially changed, if not impossible to tell. Arguably Episode 6 with the Virtue Cult, but it's so ingrained in the themes of the show that are themselves tied into the characters being young offenders that the change would have noticeable thematic impact. By Season 2, we're getting a lot more episodes that don't really have much to do with community service, but that's largely a product of the story's expanded scope, and it's relevant enough that the shift isn't immediately noticeable. Episode 2 could easily tell essentially the same story. If the group were not in community service, Nathan's brother would just need to find him somewhere else, and very little would change. Similarly, in Episode 3, if you change the scenes where the group are cleaning up garbage, there'd be nothing related to community service. I don't think this is a bad thing. I think it's the result of expanding the story, exploring more of the characters' lives, and having more fun with the potential the powers offer. But it does mean that when episode 6 ends with the gang finishing their community service, it feels like both this story and these characters have outgrown the setting in which they started. The ending scene of the episode feels like the end of an era and a goodbye to this chapter, reinforced by the Christmas special where we see these characters continuing to interact without the context of their community service. It really doesn't feel like they need the external reason to hang out the way they did in Season 1. Season 3 opens with a continuation of the same kind of thing, to the point where if you don't know that they're going to end up back in community service, it almost feels like episode 1 is a backdoor pilot for The Rudy Show about his community service adventures, while our main characters just go about their lives. But we end the episode with the remaining 4 of our original 5 back in community service, despite the fact that for the rest of the season, this has very little bearing on any of the plot lines. Episode 2 and 3 could tell the same stories, with slight changes of how Curtis finds out about the running group and how Simon and Peter end up talking, respectively. Community service has marginally more of a bearing on episode 5, but again, it would only require small changes to remove it from the main plot, and the only part that relies on it is Rudy's subplot with his mandatory anger management counselor. For the last 3 episodes of the season, the group essentially isn't even in community service since they don't have a probation worker and they're only showing up to the community center every day so that no one will suspect anything's off. There's no reason for Season 3 to be set during the characters' community service, aside from the fact that it's been established as a part of the show's premise and the writers don't want to change the status quo too much, even when it would better serve the characters and story. I wonder if you were working on any other shows that did that at the exact same time as you were writing this show, Howard. Howard Overman, creator and writer of Misfits, was also a writer on 11 episodes of BBC's Merlin. BBC Merlin ran from 2008 to 2012, so the last 4 seasons of it overlap with the first 4 seasons of Misfits. There's gonna be a couple Merlin references in this video, just ignore them, they're for me. I'm still working through some stuff. So what does the way the show incorporates community service have to do with character development? Well, if you'll recall, part of the utility of setting this story during the characters' community service is the contrast between how the world sees the main characters and our expectations of the kind of people who are likely to be superheroes. There's a tension between who these characters are and the circumstances they are in on one side, and any situation where they are called upon to do something heroic on the other. The idea that any of them would become proper superheroes is something the show plays with in several different ways, but you're always aware of that tension. Sometimes it's played for comedy, most often it's paired with the general inconvenience of most of the powers to create what Overman in interviews has called a British take on the superhero genre. Even when it comes to future Simon, one of the few times the possibility of any of these characters becoming a superhero is played straight and not used as genre commentary, the tension between Simon as we know him and his future self's heroism is still important, because looking at him and thinking, wow, how does Simon get there, is the only way the reveal carries any weight. Furthermore, even in the case of future Simon, these characters are never going to save the world. The stakes are small, largely affecting just the characters we know and care about, with 2 exceptions prior to Season 3. One is Season 2, Episode 6, where the gang preempts Monsieur Grand Fromage's murder spree via time travel, and the other is immediately after that in the Christmas special, where Elliot Jesus' actions are causing harm to people beyond the main group. These instances, combined with the general stake-raising that's been happening in Season 2, Simon's trajectory towards his future self, and the fact that all of our main characters have grown into better and more altruistic people, means that putting them back in those jumpsuits and saying, can you believe this is who has superpowers, doesn't really have the same effect. When the characters save the world on a big scale in Season 3, it doesn't feel like it's contrary to your expectations or a surprising thing. It just feels like this is where we've gotten to in this story, and that would feel a lot more deliberate if they weren't still in community service through it all. On the whole, Misfits' premise is one that works quite well, and the changes in how Overman approached that premise when writing the show as it progressed aren't changes I necessarily dislike for their own sake. The last 2 seasons of Misfits is not a bad show. it's not even really a worse show than Misfits seasons 1 to 3, it's just a different show. The only time there's really any problem with the change in approach is during the transitional period in season 3, and only because the initial approach to the premise was so tied to the characterization and development of its main characters in the first place. So let's actually talk about the main characters. Unit 1, Character Development, Lesson 2, Character Arcs. Discussion question: who is the main character of Misfits? If your answer is that it's an ensemble show without a single main character, then you are correct. But the question poses an interesting framework through which to view the show, and one I'll be using as we examine some details of character development for our main 5. There isn't one single right answer to the question, and answering it is not choosing a favorite or who you think is the most interesting. It's looking at which of the group best fits the narrative position of protagonist, and, inversely, what story you get when you choose to focus on one of them over the others. Depending on how you frame it, you could make a case for almost any of the main characters, but there is still a wrong answer, and that answer is Kelly. Kelly Bailey is never the main character of Misfits, and that is a goddamn shame. Kelly never gets an A-plot in any of the episodes. She sometimes gets really solid B-plots and other moments of character development, has 2 episode-spanning relationship arcs, and a couple of times she gets to share the A-plot or gets an equal share in plots that involve the whole group, so it's not like there's nothing for her to do. But on the whole, it just never quite feels like she's got as much development or focus as the other main characters. It's more even in season 1 than it is later on, mostly because Kelly doesn't really have that much growing to do as a character to get from where she starts to where she ends up. People are quick to judge Kelly and make assumptions about her, often related to her class and appearance. She's assumed to be a thief or otherwise criminal, even when not in her community service jumpsuit, and people generally think that she's slept with a lot more guys than she has. It's clear that people treating her this way and making these assumptions gets to her, and that's part of why she's so quick to be defensive and why she's developed such a brass and sometimes aggressive demeanor. Her character arc is just that she gets somewhat more comfortable with herself and that she's more empathetic and altruistic later in the show. The comfort with herself mostly comes from not being as quickly defensive. She's still ready to be confrontational when called for, but it's not a reaction she jumps to as quickly. In terms of altruism, that was kind of already there, more so than with a lot of the other main characters. It's just that by the end of the show, she's a little more ready to act on it. Her abrasiveness early on is clearly a bit of a front, and underneath it, she's kind and caring, especially when it comes to those close to her. She never quite drops her abrasiveness entirely. It stays present in her willingness to speak her mind regardless of what other people think, but like her defensiveness, it wanes a bit. She has an easier time showing that kindness. The main impact that Kelly's power has on her life is in her romantic relationships, which I'll get to in more detail later, and the aforementioned increase in empathy and altruism. The most explicit example of this is in season 1, episode 3, where she makes up with a girl she fought prior to the start of the show. Kelly also starts using her power, or the information it gives her, in altruistic ways earlier on, though she's defensive about it when it's pointed out.
Well, look at you using your powers being all superhero.
The interesting thing about the relationship between her power and empathy is that her power is focused mostly, though not exclusively, on letting her hear other people's judgments of her. She often hears Nathan's thoughts about himself or things unrelated to her, but not really anyone else's. Her power does not provide her with an empathy shortcut through telepathy. Instead, it provides her with occasional opportunities to help someone or do something positive that she's unable to do without it. Or, since she can hear far more of Nathan's thoughts than just concern her, she is given information that she wouldn't otherwise have and has to be sensitive to his feelings in order to keep it to herself. The theory I have regarding why Kelly can hear so much more of what Nathan thinks has long been that it's just that slightly more of his thoughts are on the surface, as it were, but I also think it speaks to something interesting in their character dynamic. There's a much more direct relationship between Kelly's power and her confidence, since her power reflects her insecurity around how others perceive her. The resolution to that is mostly that she seems to reach a point where she sort of accepts that people are going to think things about her that aren't accurate, and more importantly, that she doesn't have to keep people who do in her life. It's never really explored in depth outside of the context of romantic relationships, though, so more on that later. The most interesting thing about Kelly's character growth, and the one that is the least explored and mostly just left implied, is that she seems to have or develop ambitions for doing something positive with her life, which makes her a bit of an outlier in the group. Curtis has a career and ambitions, but they were cut short and he's bitter about it. And Simon has hobbies he probably would have looked into pursuing if his life hadn't been consumed by becoming his future self and fulfilling his destiny. But Alisha and Nathan don't seem to be thinking that far ahead, and none of the group seems to be pursuing much in the way of something beyond what they've got now. Which brings us to why the fuck Kelly is a rocket scientist in Season 3. Part of this is just my frustration at the change in approach to powers after the Christmas special, but just why? What does it bring to Kelly's character that she now has a complete knowledge of rocket science? Why would she have chosen that power specifically? It's implied that it's for the career prospects, though no companies take her seriously, so she's unable to actually get hired. But it's the first time, aside from expressing general dissatisfaction with her job on the Christmas special, that she's seemed interested in pursuing a career, let alone this career specifically. This is what I mean when I say this element of her character is mostly left implied, because it's only introduced in Season 3 and not even directly explored once it is. Again, this feels like a limitation of keeping the characters in community service. This has an impact on Kelly's potential career prospects, but it's never mentioned. The fact that the show is so tied to this setting means that it never really explores that aspect of her character, nor does it explore the fact that getting community service again would cause problems for her if she's trying to pursue a career. In Season 4, we learn from Seth that she's working to defuse landmines somewhere in Africa, and it's not a bad ending for her. She's the only main character of the 5 to get an explicitly happy ending, and you know what? Good for her. But this ending specifically feels lacking. It feels like it's almost there, because her relationship with Seth does a good job of resolving the things brought up about her romantic relationships generally, and she's increasingly vocal in Season 3 about doing the right thing, and so having her find work that is actively helping people, even at a risk to herself, makes sense. But I feel like I have to dig to find that connection. It's a show about superpowers. It could have explored the connection between powers and altruism more if that was the direction it wanted to go for Kelly. It could have contrasted Simon's superhero ambitions with Kelly's way of doing good, and it never quite got there. Kelly is a great character, and it's not that she isn't important to the story or the group dynamic, it's just that, for the most part, it's not her story being told. She just gets small subplots in a larger narrative and is a largely static character for most of her time on the cast. Curtis Donovan is the main character of Misfits on the rare occasions he gets the chance to be. Curtis is in an interesting position because on the one hand, a lot of the reasons that Kelly is not the main character could also apply to him, but on the other hand, when he gets an A-plot, he is the A-plot. It is his story, that's what the episode is about, and he gets a clear character arc that makes sense. Before the start of the show, Curtis was a professional sprinter, good enough to likely have made it to the 2012 Olympics if he hadn't gotten community service and a ban from athletics for drug possession. He is the only one of the group whose sentence has really cost him anything. None of the others like being there, obviously, but they haven't lost anything by getting community service. Kelly and Nathan's lives and prospects don't seem that changed by it, Alisha doesn't let her ankle monitor stop her from partying, and Simon had nothing going on in his life, so a group of his peers he could potentially be friends with is actually a step up. Conversely, Curtis lost a career he was passionate about, his future, and his relationship with his girlfriend Sam. He is bitter and filled with regrets, and this manifests in his power. He doesn't think he should be here, and he says it. A lot.
Shouldn't be here,
Look,
man.
you don't look I shouldn't even fucking be here.
Shouldn't even be here.
I shouldn't even be here.
So it's unsurprising that the first episode dedicated to Curtis is one that deals with that attitude. He's able to change things so that he gets back to the life he used to have, so that everything is going well for him, but when he finds out this means the others died, he deliberately makes sure he gets community service, while making sure Sam doesn't end up going to jail. He's learned to accept where he is and recognize what good can come from it. This growth for him sticks, and we hear a lot less of the "I shouldn't even be here" sentiment, though the self-pity persists sometimes. Curtis has some good stuff in Season 2, but because he more or less overcame the main thing he had to grow past 4 episodes into the show, there's disappointingly little growth for him after that point. The main difference between him and Kelly here is how much bearing Curtis's power consistently has on the plot. As you'll remember from discussing the timeline, Curtis being able to rewind time is used a lot throughout the first 2 seasons, and it means that Curtis is essentially the first of the characters to take on any heroic actions, albeit beyond his control. The lack of control he has over his power is interesting, both because it follows the trend of some powers being tied to or triggered by the emotional state of the person who has them, and because it means that Curtis's response to when he does or doesn't rewind time provides some good character stuff. He isn't able to prevent Ollie's death in Season 2 because he doesn't have enough of a relationship with Ollie to feel bad about his death, and Curtis slumps a bit back into his early Season 1 self in response to that, self-pitying and bitter. On the flip side, in Season 1, when he's breaking up with Sam, he keeps regretting it and rewinding time when she gets upset, despite the fact that he wants to end things and it frustrates him. There's no explicit exploration of it in the show, but it seems to me that Curtis's relationship with the control he has over his power, or lack thereof, is another way of learning to accept where he is and what he can and can't control. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's a well-done or consistent aspect of his development, but he approaches his breakup with Alisha very differently than his breakup with Sam in a way that reflects growth, and you could read the climax of Season 2, Episode 6 as him using his power on purpose at Simon's prompting. It's not, but it would make for a good character beat if it were, providing him with the moment that saves the day as he fully manages to move past being fixated on regret at the same time as he's finishing community service.
Rule here, rule alive. You made it.
In practice, though, it's clear that's not what this moment is. So, Season 3. Why the fuck can Curtis change his sex? His Season 3 power is that he can change into a girl, air quotes because that is the show's phrasing that reflects a reductive perspective on gender. In this case, it means that Curtis, a cis man, can transform into having an AFAB body that has not had any surgeries or hormone treatments. But why? The in-universe explanation is that it was all that was left when the group chose their powers, which feels weak as a writing choice. Seth has already sold his old power. Okay, fine and good, it was a little OP, and the show has kind of maximized its narrative potential in the previous episode. Character-wise, I can even be on board with Curtis being in a place where he's relatively happy with his life, until Nikki dies, and therefore isn't in a position where he feels like he needs the power anymore. So, okay, he won't have his old power. But why this? What does this do for Curtis's character? What does this do for your story, and why do I find it disinteresting rather than feel like it's fun gender shenanigans? I know the answer to that second question. I'll be covering it later. Foreshadowing. Curtis's new power provides us with an episode that feels like a spiritual sequel to the time loop episode. Upon realizing that he can get around his ban by competing in women's sports under the name Melissa, Curtis gets involved with a running group at the community center, and the episode uses his relationship with fellow runner Emma to prompt self-reflection and growth for Curtis. This takes 3 forms. Part 1. Curtis is still fixated on his past as runner and what he lost, and needs to let go and find something else he can care about the way he cared about running. Part 2. Curtis learns about what misogyny is. Part 3. Curtis is bad at sex and needs to learn how to more effectively please a woman. Which, yeah, okay, fine. This episode, taken on its own, does a very good job at giving Curtis a character arc that resolves a flaw and prompts growth. However, once you take it in context, it starts to fall apart. He's already moved past most if not all of his negativity, and we haven't seen him fall back into it in a long time, not even in response to Nikki's death. You could do something exploring the fact that he no longer has something that he's passionate about the way he was about running, but the resolution of Season 1, Episode 4 only works if you understand it as him letting go of the potential future he once had and accepting that running no longer holds the place in his life it once did. This episode is an excellent example of the change in the approach to characterization that we've already discussed. Rather than establishing the character traits and using a power to explore those traits and reflect a character's growth, in Season 3, it feels like the powers and the situations they could lead to came first, and then Overman came up with what those powers would mean for the characters' journeys, if they lead to anything at all. There is nothing wrong with that writing approach. It works just fine, but when it is introduced to an existing story partway through, it feels at odds with the previous material and like it leads to introducing a flaw in order to resolve it, rather than exploring traits that have actually been present in a character. Not to mention that the episode ends with Curtis resolving to find something that isn't running to care about, and then he doesn't. He doesn't even try to. It's forgotten after this episode. Curtis eventually gets rid of his second power, and instead gets the power to bring people back from the dead, with the catch that they end up as zombies. This is largely used for plot, not character purposes, continuing the footsteps of his initial ability. Honestly, I feel like the show missed something in not bringing up Nikki during the zombie plotline. Seth and Curtis are actually in very similar places, having both lost a girlfriend and both feeling at least partially responsible for it. Seth feels as though he owes it to Sharon to bring her back, much like Curtis wanted to get back his first power to save Nikki. There could also be a really interesting connection made between Curtis's first power and his third. Both allow him to undo deaths in different ways, and both can interact with regret and with a feeling of responsibility to help. You could see getting the power to revive the dead and realizing that he can't use it since people come back wrong as a really good stepping stone from having a power that meant Curtis dwelled on regret. He goes from compulsively undoing the deaths of those he cares about to needing to choose to make it happen and facing negative consequences if he were to do so. And you could use the connection between those two powers to explore how far Curtis has come as a character and the relationship he has with the various losses, both professional and personal, he's experienced. The show does not make any of those connections, either implicitly or explicitly. Nikki isn't even mentioned once in Season 3, which is a massive disservice to both her character and Curtis's. Curtis's story ends with his death in Season 4, in a heroic sacrifice that would hold more weight if anyone other than Rudy were around for Curtis to say goodbye to. It's a decent way of writing him out of the show, though it's not quite as satisfying as Simon and Alisha. If you choose to view the end of Season 3 as the end of the story, then Curtis, like Kelly, ends up in only a slightly different position than the one in which he started. He has grown, and he's had an impact on the story, but there's still a lot of unfilled potential to his character. Nathan Young is the main character of the first season of Misfits. Nathan is, in a lot of ways, the standout character of the show. I've seen a lot of people express that it just wasn't the same after Robert Sheehan left, or that they stopped watching because he was gone. Nathan, as a character, demands attention in a way that is hard to go against, and even when he's being an annoying asshole, Sheehan's performance brings a charisma and likability that still makes him an enjoyable character. In some ways, he might seem quite static as a character, but not because the story doesn't put him through character development or the writing fails him. Rather, Nathan as a person resists growth, and even when it's happening, he's reluctant to fully admit it. In part because his power isn't revealed until the very end of Season 1, his storylines also involve a lot more of his life outside of community service in a way that never quite happens for the other characters. We meet both of his parents, we get to see what his relationship with each of them is like and how it changes over the course of different storylines. We learn about his childhood through his interactions with his parents and later his half-brother, but also just from him bringing it up and talking about it. We learn, in a masterful scene in the first episode, that he doesn't really have any close friends, and that the friends he does have don't like him that much, which is underscored subtly a couple times as the show continues. He has everything. Daddy issues, a criminal record, a deep loneliness that he covers up with humor and attention-seeking, the complete inability to remember anyone's name, immortality, and if you believe Misfits Tumblr, he's even bisexual. I don't believe Misfits Tumblr, but I do support them. Keep having fun.
I'm not gay. Look at me.
You sure about
I'm about 98% certain.
Over the course of Season 1, Nathan doesn't get that much more attention than any of the other characters, but he gets just enough more that it stands out, and he's a lot more consistently at or close to the foreground of the episodes so that he feels like the lead among the group. The final episode of the season essentially has Nathan as our sole point of view character for a solid chunk of it, as the others are each brainwashed by the virtue cult, or go into hiding if they're Simon. That final episode is a large part of why the first season is so centered on Nathan, because he dies at the end. That death would probably hold weight if it were any of the five, but it hits a little harder when it's the character who's been just that tiny bit more central to the story, and who has had slightly more going on in terms of episode-spanning plots. Not to mention that immediately prior to his death, Season 1 culminates with a big speech from Nathan essentially stating the themes of the show. Season 1 of Misfits is Nathan Young's story. The other characters just get episodes sometimes. This is not the case in Season 2, where he feels a lot more on even footing with the rest of the cast, and it does seem like more of an ensemble piece. Even when he's important to the plot of an episode or gets moments of growth, it's a lot more likely that he's sharing the story with other characters, and there are a couple episodes where he takes a back seat to the rest of the group. This is because with Season 2, we start to see a lot more of what ends up forming the larger story told by the first 3 seasons, and Nathan isn't central to that. Season 2 also explores more of Nathan's relationship with his power now that it's been revealed, and it's interesting to note that Nathan's immortality reinforces the existing character traits that are the reason he has the power, rather than leading to growth. When Nathan does get growth as a result of the power, it's because he can see ghosts, which has more to do with the fact that most of his development comes primarily from his relationships with other characters than it does from his power itself. The majority of Nathan's character development, when he lets himself be earnest enough to let it show, is towards slightly more maturity and willingness to let himself be sincere and take things seriously, though it never goes very far. It's unclear how much further it would have gone had Robert Sheehan not left the show, but from the trajectory of the first 2 seasons and his ending, I get the sense that it would continue to be give and take. So, how does Nathan's story end? Depending on how you interact with the show, Nathan either gets a decently happy ending or a pretty unhappy one. In the Christmas special, he meets Marnie, and the two of them quickly start a relationship. She's pregnant, and Nathan tells her that he wants to help support her and the baby. In season 1, Nathan thinking he could support a baby was played for comedy and rightly depicted as ridiculous and something that he would only do because he was brainwashed. But now he's doing the exact same thing, and it's played, if not straight, then at least as though he's in earnest about doing the best he can. Honestly, the only reason it works is because Marnie is exactly the right character to be on the same page with him on this. In season 3, we learn that the two of them are in Vegas, and that Nathan is using his new power to cheat money out of the casinos there. Probably not a great idea, but on the whole, it's nice that he and Marnie are still together, and hopefully they're doing alright raising a child. If you watch Vegas Baby, which was released online just before the start of season 3, then you learn that he gets caught cheating and is arrested and jailed. So, having looked into it, I found that he's likely facing fines and a sentence of 1 to 5 years, if found guilty. If he contacts the British Embassy, he could get their help and potentially even get transferred to a prison in the UK to serve his sentence, which is marginally better, and hopefully his mother would be able to help Marnie out while he's there. Either way, it's kind of a disappointing ending for Nathan, even if it makes sense that he would have gotten caught. That disappointment isn't because it's sad. Plenty of the characters have sad endings, but just because it feels kind of bleak. It means that he goes from a young offender in community service to someone with an even more serious criminal record who's unable to support his partner and child and whose only friends don't know what happened to him because when he tries to call Simon, Rudy picks up and thinks it's a wrong number. That's just a different kind of sad from a tragic death. At least a tragedy provides catharsis. At least it feels like the deaths happen for a narrative reason, unlike watching Nathan ruin his life and have it played for comedy. For better or for worse, though, this is Nathan's exit from the show, leaving us to discuss the 2 remaining contenders for main character and to examine the broader story of the first 3 seasons of Misfits. Alisha Daniels might be the main character of Misfits. The strongest evidence in favor of this is that she is the point-of-view character during our introduction to the story that spans seasons 2 and 3, and that said story both directly leads to and is spurred by major character development on her part. Alisha, on the whole, has one of the strongest character arcs of the main 5, and some of the biggest differences between where she starts and where she ends up. Her power has the largest impact on her daily life of any of the group, and it's also the only one to be exclusively negative. Our main discussion on Alisha's power will take place during Unit 3, but the fact that anyone she touches immediately becomes aroused and wants to have sex with her means that Alisha eventually stops going out and partying every night and results in substantial change to how she interacts with the world around her. At the start of the show, she goes out partying a lot, is a little bit shallow, and is clearly very aware of her own attractiveness and chooses to use it to her advantage. She mentions several friends by name and is often on the phone or texting in early episodes, but none of those relationships seem very close, and the phone calls and stories about them drop off after Alisha stops going out as much. She's also pretty bad at being emotionally vulnerable or discussing her emotions in any real way. She's not used to it and therefore uncomfortable with doing so when it comes up. Nor is she especially kind to people around her, though this is common to essentially all of the group to varying degrees. Over the course of the first season, most of her development happens through reckoning with her power and through her relationship with Curtis, the first serious relationship she's ever been in, and one that starts her on the first halting steps towards being more comfortable with emotional vulnerability and intimacy. In Season 2, the future Simon storyline essentially starts as Alisha's story since the audience is following her for it, and it stays that way until she finally tells Simon about his future self. Meeting future Simon has a big effect on Alisha. Over the course of their relationship and in response to his death, she goes through a lot of growth in a very short span of time. She's already been traveling away from the person she was at the start of season 1, but meeting him prompts her to reflect more on her past self and the parts that she's not proud of or wants to change. Knowing that the person who's been helping out the group for the past several weeks is Simon, and falling in love with him starts to make her want to take action when someone's doing something wrong. She's also a lot more emotionally open with future Simon than she's typically comfortable with, because all versions of Simon have an earnestness so direct it would obliterate anyone's defenses given the chance. And that change extends beyond her interactions with him and continues after he dies, partially because it's a change that's already in progress and partially because of the grief that she's feeling. By the Christmas special, she and Simon are together, and he knows about his future self. Alisha has a decent life, but it's still not really satisfying because of her power and the looming knowledge that one day something will prompt Simon to go back in time. The Christmas special is about all the characters, and the main plot serves all of them pretty well, except for Kelly, but in a lot of ways it's primarily Alisha's story. She wants to be able to have a normal relationship, a normal life, and she is the first one to seek out Seth and sell her power. Alisha continues to push for normalcy in Season 3 as well, which brings me to the biggest problem with Alisha's new power. Alisha shouldn't have a new power. From a writing perspective, Season 3 would be stronger if she didn't. The one she sold was never anything but negative, and couldn't have in any way averted Nikki's death, meaning, unlike the others, she has no moment of realization prompting her to try and get it back. She sees the whole power thing, the idea of being anything approaching a superhero, as something to be avoided. We know that future Simon's time travel power leads to an immutable timeline and self-confirming time travel, but Alisha does not, nor does she have the genre familiarity to know what that means. She wants Simon to give up on becoming his future self and never travel back to the past so that the two of them can continue to be happy in the present. She doesn't want him to pursue his superhero fantasy. She wants to be a normal couple. Character-wise, it makes more sense for Alisha not to buy a new power, and her ability to see through other people's eyes has, at best, a tenuous connection to her character growth so far. Plot-wise, her power is rarely used, and when it does solve a problem, it's far from the only thing that could have. Alisha easily could have stayed without a power, and honestly should have. She continues to be very involved in the story and make decisions that drive the plot, often without ever once using her power, so being without one wouldn't lessen her involvement in the events of the show, it would just strengthen her motivation to have a normal life without the bullshit that comes with powers. In Season 3, Episode 3, the plot of the episode is Peter using his power to attempt to force Simon and Alisha's relationship into familiar genre beats of a superhero narrative, only for Alisha to fight against it and push back. She refuses to live in a superhero story. And it almost works out for her. Alisha's story ends with her death. It's a death that works well narratively. From a writing perspective, she dies for a reason, just not a reason for her character. The main plot of Season 2 and 3 is fairly evenly shared by Simon and Alisha, and serves both of them quite well, but this moment does not. This moment is to spur Simon to action, to give him a reason to travel back in time and become his future self. Yes, indirectly, this leads to Alicia's own growth and a relationship that means as much to her as it does to Simon, but no part of the framing of her death or even the episode around it emphasizes that. Unlike future Simon, her death is brutal, sudden, and something she has no choice in. Rachel isn't even trying to kill her specifically, Alisha just surprises her. Alisha, as a character, is genuinely really well written and developed, and so much about her story is so well done. And her death just doesn't quite stick the landing. Simon Bellamy is probably the main character of Misfits, and even if he isn't, he's definitely the hero. Simon starts as socially awkward, shy, and deeply lonely, and maybe a tiny bit creepy. He gets so much better, I promise. He's spent large parts of his life ignored or bullied by his peers, and he's so desperate for friends that it hurts. I love him with all of my heart. His big tearful eyes and unavoidable tragic fate have captivated me. He is Blorbo from my shows. I have a type? Simon also lives in a different genre from the rest of the characters. His knowledge of superhero tropes and other nerdy stuff means that his expectations for what happens when you develop superpowers are wildly different from what everyone else thinks is going to happen, and from the world he's living in. He actively tries to control his invisibility and learn how to use it voluntarily, rather than leave it as something that happens only in response to emotional reactions. The relationship between Simon's genre savviness and the show's own take on superheroes is an interesting one. There are several points when his knowledge is just generally useful, but there's also this pattern that will happen in several episodes. Basically, something will happen that also happens in superhero or other genre fiction, and Simon will warn the group about what happens next.
What are they going to do to us?
They'll treat us like freaks. They'll lock us up in a secret military facility and conduct experiments on us. It's like in Superman 2 when Superman gives up his powers so that he could be with Lois Lane.
And?
General Zod took over the world. If we don't, the infection will spread. We'll end up the sole survivors locked in a shopping center. That's what happens.
He is never right. But also he kind of is. The closest he comes to being right about the specifics is the Christmas special, but generally he's wrong about the specifics but right to be alarmed. And in every case past the Virtue Cult episode, when faced with a reason to rise to the occasion and be a hero, he does it, and drags the show into the genre he's living in, if only for a brief moment. The ultimate culmination of this is, of course, the future Simon plotline, where he gets to actually be the superhero he's always wanted to be, if only for this small group of people. A lot of Simon's actions are motivated by his friends. In Season 1, Sally is only able to manipulate him because of his isolation and loneliness. She sees how much he'd like to be friends with the others and how they treat him in response. The first episode of Season 2 focuses on him dealing with how things were for him before the start of the show, and essentially concludes by affirming that he feels wanted and useful to this group of people he's found, and you can see a lot of how he behaves in Season 2 and the growth he goes through is because of that. The main difference between Season 1 Simon and Season 2 Simon is that in the first season he's struggling to feel included and to get others to like him, but in Season 2 he isn't as much, which both contributes to and comes from his increased confidence. Also, the turning point for that shift is murder, so that's fun. Season 2 Simon is less cowed by Nathan, he's more willing to stand up for himself, he makes jokes. Because Season 2 also introduces us to future Simon, we get to see what he's growing towards, as well as how excellent Ewan Rayon is at playing two versions of the same character back to back. Season 2 Simon is in the process of growing, but he hasn't fully gotten to the end point of his arc. Learning about his future self, about his destiny, not to mention his relationship with Alisha, continues the development he's already on and provides him with a specific direction for the rest of the show. Simon's new power in Season 3 is limited visions of the immediate future, or rather, possible immediate futures, because they don't have to happen and can often be entirely averted. And I really wish that the show did more with this. Simon is a character who belongs in a fatalist tragedy. He belongs in a story about free will and determinism and whether or not you can avoid your eventual fate, and in what ways you just confirm what was going to happen all along. Like Merlin. And he almost is, just not one that's quite interested enough in the connections it could be making. Like Merlin! There are 2 episodes in Season 3 that are concerned with this, and one of them, the season finale, directly involves Simon's new power, but is somewhat lacking. In earlier episodes, Simon tries to change the visions he gets, but in episode 8 he thinks he's supposed to go along with it. And I don't mind this contradiction being present. I just think that the show does not sufficiently explore it. Nor does it do much with the relationship between being able to see possible yet avoidable futures and living your life for your predetermined destiny you firmly believe has to happen and that you actively want to fulfill. And boy, howdy does Simon live his life for his predetermined destiny. He wants to be his future self so badly. He knows with certainty that he gets to be a superhero and gets to be a version of himself who is cool and confident and capable, the version of himself that Alisha first fell in love with. He spends months working towards being that person, and in the course of doing so, he ends up essentially idealizing his own death. His infatuation with getting to be heroic is inseparable from his death to save Alisha, and it's unsettling to watch him talk about it. A lot of Simon's mindset in Season 3 retroactively informs future Simon's behavior in Season 2 and gives you a new perspective if you go back and rewatch it. Yes, he's different from the present version of Simon in that season because of his character growth, but he's also different because he's deliberately acting this way. I'm not saying it's disingenuous, but I think that knowing he finally gets to be this other version of himself has an effect on how he acts after he's spent so long idealizing this part of his future. His confidence is as much a product of being more sure of himself and the growth he's gone through as it is knowing that when Alisha met this version of himself, he was cool and confident. Before we cover Simon's death, I want to briefly mention his new powers. Presumably he keeps his precognition, and in addition to it he gets one-way time travel and immunity from other people's powers. This is the only situation where the lack of any connections to Simon's character feels like it works. Perhaps it's just my personal enjoyment of the storyline, overcoming any dislike I have for the change in approach to the premise, but it feels right that when Simon gets to finally be a superhero, he's able to choose his own powers based on what he knows he needs, rather than letting an exterior force like the Storm choose them, or being confined by existing limitations. Simon's death is, like so many of his actions, motivated by helping his friends and by his love for Alisha. He dies saving her, and in his last moments makes sure all the others will be safe as well. Unlike Alisha, his death is the result of an active choice on his part and serves his character a lot more directly. Not only is it a fitting end to Simon's storyline and a bittersweet fulfillment of the destiny he's been fixated on, it also happens so that his past self can eventually become him and close the loop. Yes, Alicia's development is served by Simon's death, but that's not where the main emphasis is on how the story is told. The focus instead is on Simon's journey toward his future self, and that Alisha is seeing him differently. When Alisha dies, the focus is exclusively on Simon, and by spending the last chunk of Season 3, Episode 8 on his preparations to go back in time, any relation his trip has to Alicia's character development is obscured in favor of what it means for Simon. Simon's death is tragic, yes, but it's tragic in a way that provides catharsis and feels like a satisfying end to his story, even if it's not a happy end. Alicia's death is tragic in that it is senseless and heartbreaking. I know why it has to be there for the story, and to be clear, I adore Simon and Alicia's story, but her death does not feel cathartic or like a satisfying end to her story. The tragedy comes from a different place. The overarching story of the second and third season of Misfits is that of Simon and Alicia's closed-loop time travel love story, but primarily it is Simon's story, and that of his journey to being a superhero. Simon is the only one of the group directly involved in the overarching story of Season 1, even if it's more or less in the background for most of the season, and he is the protagonist of Seasons 2 and 3. He's not the main character of every episode or the focus of the ensemble, but he is the main character of the broader story being told by the first 3 seasons of this show. Unit 2, Relationships. Lesson 1, Group Dynamics. The main characters of Misfits are an interesting friend group. Important to their dynamic as a group is that none of them really have any friends outside of the community service group. We've gone over this when it comes to Simon, Nathan, and Alisha, but it's true of Kelly and Curtis too. Any friendship or community Curtis had seemed to have ended with his career, and Kelly clearly doesn't have a very easy time making friends. Simon is the most open with his loneliness, but none of these people have anyone but each other, and the group wouldn't come together the way it does if that weren't the case. It's fun to watch them go from a group of people who don't really want to be around each other to people who start to find ways to have fun while they're all supposed to be working, to a group that willingly and readily forms a united front, to friends that just hang out, even when they don't have community service together. But that's not what we're here for. We're here for the individual connections between characters. Few, if any, of these specific friendships get central attention at any point during the show, but that is part of why I want to devote time to them now, to examine development that mostly happens in the background, and to look at the details of how this group works. We'll start with the least interesting stuff and move up. Curtis and Kelly. These two have few direct interactions and aren't ever really paired up for storylines. They get along, but they're not close. They get a little bit more in Season 3 during the Shannon storyline, where Curtis feels conflicted about bringing back Seth's ex-girlfriend since Kelly's dating Seth, but even then there's not much to talk about here. They're friends. They get along. Nothing much else is going on. Curtis's friendship with Simon is basically the same as his friendship with Kelly. They don't have a relationship earlier in the show, though I want to highlight that Curtis is nice enough to Simon most of the time. By Season 3, though, they both get to be a little closer through a combination of the passage of time and the fact that Nathan isn't around anymore and Rudy is new. There is enjoyably little drama over the whole Alisha of it all. Simon never gets weird about the fact that she and Curtis used to date, and the only time Curtis is shitty is when he's manipulated into it in Season 2, Episode 1, which is before Alisha had any reason to be interested in Simon. Curtis and Alisha don't really interact directly all that much after their breakup, but in Season 3 they get to the point where they're able to be friends, and I like that. There's not a whole lot to say about it, but I like it. Also, I'd like to point out that Curtis's non-romantic relationships with the rest of the group get some of the least development, and that kind of sucks. It feels like that part of his character wasn't given as much thought as it was for the other characters. I don't like it. Kelly and Alisha are solidly friends. They talk about relationship stuff, they'll walk together and make casual conversation, or complain about their powers. They get along, they give each other compliments, they look out for each other. It's good. They're friends. Early on, it seems like Alisha might be a bit shitty to Kelly, but that passes pretty quickly. I like how their interactions are written, and I'm glad they're never pitted against each other. I haven't gone through to see if any of their interactions pass the Bechdel test, but that's not the be-all and end-all of writing women, and while a lot of Kelly and Alicia's interactions do involve talking about guys, for the most part I'd say that their friendship is well done and feels genuine. They're clearly closer than any of the friendships sort of lower down on this list, but it's not that complicated. Curtis and Nathan get to be higher on this list than the other four pairs we've talked about, not because they are close. They're not, at all. But because their relationship is very funny. As far as Nathan's concerned, they're friends. As far as Curtis is concerned, Nathan is an annoying asshat, and Curtis probably wouldn't be spending time with him if he had other options. I get the sense that's the case in a lot of Nathan's friendships, a good 3 out of 5 of the people he calls in the first episode, for instance. Somehow, though, Curtis and Nathan end up having a decent number of one-on-one interactions, or just conversations where Nathan's general way of acting means that Curtis is essentially friends with him, as much as he also finds him annoying. It's pretty good characterization for both of them, and is our first example on this list that is only possible because of the loneliness of the characters involved. I've made mention of Simon and Kelly's friendship in the past, and how a lot of it consists of Kelly defending Simon, particularly against Nathan. They have a really nice dynamic. Not only does she stand up to other people on his behalf, she's also the only one in the group early on who has a kind response to Simon's attempts to get the group of them to all hang out outside of community service. Kelly encourages him when he likes Jessica in Season 2. She jokingly teases him in a way that's actually nice. I like it. In turn, Simon treats Kelly more kindly than most people do, and he's certainly never judgmental about her. He's really sweet to her after Nathan's death, and deliberately makes sure she hears his thoughts so that he can comfort her privately. It's sweet! They're friends and it's sweet! Once he starts to get more confident, he also starts to reciprocate some of that standing up to others that Kelly's been doing for him. Not that she often needs it. I cannot understate how much it matters that Simon is consistently and continually kind to Kelly, starting pretty much right away. Given that early on the framing of her power is defined by just how poorly other people think of her, and the fact that people around her acting on those assumptions about her is what has led her to develop that prickly defensiveness, it's nice to see someone who is always just kind to her. On a rewatch, you notice how quickly Kelly starts liking Simon, and if you pay attention, their friendship is one of the strongest ones in the group. Big fan. 10 out of 10. Kelly and Nathan's dynamic is one that I think is really interesting, even ignoring the romantic aspect of their relationship. But unlike Curtis and Alisha, there isn't a significant period of the show where some element of their romantic feelings isn't relevant. And anything I want to say about how they interact and play off each other is going to be a part of the discussion of their romantic relationship. So I'm just going to point out that they are genuinely friends, and I feel should have been best friends in their own atypical way had Nathan been present in Season 3. Alisha and Nathan are the same. They are. They are parallels for each other in so many ways, and it's fascinating to think about, especially since they don't really like each other all that much. Nathan doesn't dislike Alisha, but they don't really interact much one-on-one. As far as Alicia's concerned, she and Nathan aren't friends, and unlike Curtis, she'll say it to his face.
Hey, these are my friends.
I'm not your friend.
These are my friends.
I'm not your friend.
She's lying.
When they do have a storyline together in Season 2, Episode 5, the similarities between them become evident, and as soon as you start noticing them, you can't stop. They're both initially very bad at emotions, both their own and responding to those of others, and for both of them this is mixed in with an aversion to showing any kind of emotional vulnerability unless they absolutely have to. For both of them, this is highlighted with regards to romantic relationships.
I can't do these big relationship moments, alright?
I'm not good at this serious girl stuff and feelings and shit.
Though Alisha gets a lot more direct development in that regard than Nathan does. Nathan gets some development in how he approaches his relationship with Kelly, but not a whole lot. Instead, most of his is focused on his familial relationships, particularly with his parents. There's an interesting comparison to make between Nathan's plot in Season 2, Episode 2, and the way his brother's death changes how he approaches his relationship with his father, and the future Simon plotline and the effect his death has on Alisha. Obviously it's not identical, and Alisha and Nathan diverge in several areas, but the similarities that are present fascinate me, as do the ways they interact on the rare occasions they have called to. And finally, we come to Simon and Nathan. Where to even begin? They're friends, kind of. They're not friends. By the time we get to the Christmas special, they're definitely for sure friends, but getting there is odd. Okay, so in Season 1, Simon certainly really wants them to be friends, as he does for all of them, and Nathan can definitely tell how much Simon wants that and uses that to mess with him more than he would if Simon were less chronically sincere about everything. He also picks on Simon pretty mercilessly and does not know Simon's name.
Save me, Barry!
In the first episode of Season 2, Simon gets a great moment where he stands up to Nathan about all the bullying and says he just wants to be friends. And despite Nathan being characteristically uncomfortable with directly saying it, he agrees and says he and Simon are friends. So, they're friends. But, their friendship is characterized by Simon acting like they're friends and treating Nathan like they're close, and Nathan acting basically the same as he always has and kind of like he doesn't really care about Simon, except that he clearly does, and even begrudgingly admits as much to Alisha. I want to say that I think Simon knows, but honestly, I don't think he does. I just think that for him, the verbal confirmation that Nathan is friends with him is good enough, and so he just keeps acting like they are. I think he figures it out eventually. Probably. It's honestly unclear. They're fucking fascinating to watch because I don't think either of them is used to having proper friends, and they've just taken that in complete opposite directions. Nathan is perfectly happy to confidently claim friendship with Alisha and Curtis despite their clear indifference to him, but Simon's outright interest in friendship works against him because Nathan sees sincerity as something to be mocked. And because Simon starts out as a weird, quiet loser, cowed by Nathan picking on him. Simon, meanwhile, is so desperate for any kind of companionship that he'll keep trying even when someone is a complete dick to him. And, it works. They're friends eventually, but God, are they both so bad at this. It's mesmerizing to watch. And yes, I'm aware that a not insignificant part of the internet ships these two. I'm glad that people are having fun, but it's not for me. I don't see their dynamic that way, and I'm way too much of a Simon and Alisha shipper for Simon and Nathan to hold any appeal. Unit 2, Relationships. Lesson 2, Intragroup Dating. Alright, romantic relationships. Misfits is a show with a lot of intergroup dating, to the point that it even makes a joke about it in the first episode.
The way I see it, we're a girl short, man.
How's that?
There's 3 of us and only 2 of them, so it looks like one of us is going without. I'm not being funny, but I'm guessing you drew the short straw. Bad luck.
It knows what kind of show it is. It knows this is a large part of why its audience is here. I've put up all the various romantic connections between our main group and, for fun, added all the relationships outside of the group, so you can see that even without the intra-group dating, we're not quite outside the realm of convoluted connections. Orange notes some kind of actual dating. White, some kind of interest or flirtation that doesn't quite go anywhere, and red is sleeping together in the absence of a full-fledged relationship. Oh, and gray indicates some kind of power fuckery. We'll get to it. You'll notice that some of these relationships have more than one of these colors? Why do Kelly and Nathan have both a relationship and a flirtation that goes nowhere? Because I said so, that's why. We'll be focusing on just the relationships within the main groups for now, and moving on to these outside ones later, highlighting the central relationships for all of our main characters. Except Rudy. Forget about Rudy, he doesn't matter, treat him like he's one of the other secondary characters. So, without further ado, let's get into it. There are 3 canon pairings of characters within the original 5 main characters, and in this section, we'll be covering the 2 of those that don't manage to work out long term. Curtis and Alisha, and Kelly and Nathan. Alisha and Curtis are the first couple to get together, or even show interest in each other within the group, and having made my bias as a Simon and Alisha shipper known, I want to start off by saying that I like Curtis and Alisha together. They're a good couple with interesting storylines, and for a lot of Season 1, even on rewatches, I'm rooting for them. Are they endgame? No, but that does not diminish that they were together for a month and a half, and it worked. Talking about their relationship is almost inseparable from talking about Alicia's power, so if it seems like I'm overlooking anything or failing to fully discuss it, it's because I'll be getting into it more fully later. We won't be recapping the full course of their relationship, but rather discussing their dynamic generally and highlighting a few main points of interest, namely intimacy in the absence of physical touch, Alicia's experience with committed relationships, and fidelity. The biggest obstacle in Curtis and Alicia's relationship is that they can't touch each other without Alicia's power affecting Curtis. Given that, under the influence of her power, Curtis can no longer give actual consent or retract consent were he to give it prior to Alisha touching him. This means they cannot touch, and so despite the fact that they are people who both want physical intimacy in a relationship, they don't touch each other. So, they find ways around this.
We could try phone sex without the phone.
This seems to be largely fine with them for a while, but there are moments that allude to the fact that neither is really happy with that. They both want to be able to actually touch their partner generally and each other specifically. I'm more interested, though, in the ways that this affects them other than sex. They find ways to almost but not quite touch each other and to express other forms of tenderness, but what I really like about it is that it manages to convey the desire to make actual contact with each other. The best example of this is after Nathan's death, where there's a moment when, sitting at a glass table, Curtis places his hand on one side of it and Alisha puts hers on the other. This encompasses the tone of their relationship. The care is there, the affection is there, but there is also a barrier between them that they both wish was gone. If they could, they would be expressing that affection in a different way, but they're making the most of what is available to them. It's nice, it's sweet, it is a relationship that matters and works, but still has an undercurrent of dissatisfaction beyond their control, and that is narratively and emotionally compelling. The fact that Curtis and Alisha cannot touch is a constant in their relationship, and there's never a point when you can forget that barrier between them, but with the exception of them actually getting together, it's not really the main focus of the storylines that center their relationship. Rather, we get focus on how their relationship changes as it gets more serious, and what it means for both of them to be in a committed relationship. Alisha has never been in a serious relationship before, and in the relationships she has been in, she hasn't been faithful. Curtis telling her about accidentally time-traveling his way into being in simultaneous relationships with her and Sam leads to the first conversation the two of them have about getting serious, during which Alisha freely admits to not being good at that kind of conversation about relationships. That's part of the overall discomfort she has with emotional vulnerability, as we already discussed, but more importantly, it's relevant to how Alisha changes by virtue of being in a relationship with Curtis. From there, it's mostly small moments and background development, but you do see the change start to happen, and it's an interesting part of Alicia's arc. The storyline with Sam also brings up the issue of fidelity. The two of them acknowledging that their relationship is getting serious is specifically in the context of agreeing not to sleep with or date anyone else, which in and of itself isn't particularly noteworthy were it not for the way that their relationship ends. In Season 2, the group meet Nikki. However, prior to that, Curtis briefly time travels forward to a moment when he and Nikki are already dating. He doesn't tell Alisha about this. Or rather, he tells her, but without mentioning Nikki. He also doesn't tell Alisha about visiting Nikki after the group breaks into her apartment. He and Nikki aren't doing anything, and Curtis isn't cheating on Alisha, but one could make the case that he's emotionally cheating on her, especially given how quickly he and Nikki get together after he and Alisha break up. Alisha is cheating on Curtis. Pretty unrepentantly, too. Future Simon tells her to keep seeing Curtis while they're together, and yeah, time travel, he has his reasons, but that doesn't change that Alisha is cheating on Curtis during the end of their relationship. After Curtis gets together with Nikki, he has a short conversation about it with Alisha, but it's unclear how much Curtis ever learns about Alicia's relationship with Future Simon. He only learns the guy in the mask was Simon at all at the end of season 3, and he knows that Simon's going back to make Alisha fall in love with him as well as the rest of it. But yeah, who knows if he puts it together or not. Either way though, this
I won't shag anyone either, and if I do, I'll tell you about it.
ends up being a lie. Curtis and Alicia's eventual breakup isn't really about the cheating, though obviously it's relevant. They'd be drifting apart anyway. The fact that there are parts of their lives that are hiding from each other makes it worse, and then that turns into developing feelings for other people. Of course, knowing that Future Simon can touch her while Curtis still can't, and eventually the fact that Alisha is falling in love with Future Simon is what really seals things. I like the way their breakup is done quite a bit. Both of them kind of know things are wrong, and Alisha in particular is withdrawing from the relationship, but it feels more or less mutual. Also, I really like that the fact they can't touch each other is clearly something that bothers both of them, and relevant to their breakup, but not the reason for it. It feels in keeping with the way Alicia's power has affected their relationship up to that point. Overall, I like Curtis and Alicia's relationship. It's well written, and the narrative very effectively keeps the audience on board with whatever's happening at a given point in their relationship's arc. On a rewatch, knowing that they eventually break up doesn't sour the good parts, and even enjoying the beginning of their relationship, their breakup still is understandable. It's a relationship that works, and then ends, and it still mattered. Good writing! I like it. Now, if Curtis and Alisha are a well-written relationship that ends but leave the audience at peace with that and okay with the characters moving on to other people, Kelly and Nathan are a wonderful jumble of build-up and potential that is cruelly and mercilessly cut short, dashed to pieces by a writing decision I will never understand nor get over, not unlike the entirety of the TV show Merlin. Kelly and Nathan. Kelly and Nathan are two people who flirt, who express that they're both into each other, who kind of, sort of go on a couple things that could have been dates, but who never actually get together. Kelly and Nathan cannot stop getting in their own way and messing it all up over small things, but when they get to have moments of vulnerability or tenderness, when Nathan's efforts to be sweet actually work, when Kelly doesn't get defensive and jump to conclusions, they work really well. Kelly and Nathan are a mess, and they probably wouldn't have been able to make it work long term, but god damn it if I don't want to see them try, at least for a couple episodes. When looking at Kelly and Nathan as a pairing, you're looking at the period of the show up to Season 2, Episode 5, but for the first several episodes of Season 1, it's not explicitly romantic, and it's interesting to watch their relationship trend in that direction in tandem with them becoming friends. They don't start off on a good foot. Kelly, like almost everyone he meets, is annoyed by Nathan, particularly once she gets her power, and the second thing she hears him think is deciding whether he'd have sex with her. And actually, that's one of the first aspects of their relationship that I think is interesting to talk about. Unlike Curtis checking out Alisha, Nathan's initial interest in sleeping with Kelly isn't a part of him being interested in her romantically, and it's not even that specific to her as a person. He's just horny. Kelly, understandably and with good reason, reacts pretty negatively the first couple of times she hears him thinking about it. Every time after the first time, Nathan is aware she can hear his thoughts about it and tries to stop himself, mostly out of embarrassment.
If she can hear what I'm thinking, does she know I want to shag her? Oh shit, she can hear that! I'm not getting a shag now, I'm a homeless. Those big issue guys aren't getting any. Oh shit, she can hear that! When are you gonna learn?
But eventually we get to this.
Don't think about shagging her. Don't think about shagging her. You're thinking about shagging her. You're an idiot.
You heard that, didn't you? I'm a man. We think about shagging everyone.
Thanks a lot.
No, I didn't mean it like that.
You are so shit at this. How'd you ever get laid?
Once they're both actually into each other, how they react to it changes, and Nathan's attempts to get himself not to think about it feel as much about Kelly as they do about his own embarrassment. It's hard to describe how exactly that transition happens, because between the front Kelly puts up to protect herself and Nathan doing everything in his power to never express any kind of vulnerability ever, the two of them are both doing a pretty good job of hiding what they're actually feeling most of the time. Nathan's dumb, attention-seeking antics amuse Kelly sometimes, and she doesn't put up with his bullshit. Not just when he's trying to get a rise out of people, but also when he's trying to hide things. She's persistent, which means that she manages to get stuff out of him that he wouldn't say otherwise. Kelly also learns things about him involuntarily through her power, and I like that she gets better at not accidentally sharing it or bringing it up when he doesn't want her to. None of that is romantic, not exclusively, but all of that is happening while they're also developing feelings for each other, and informs how their dynamic works as they start to have more romantic moments, or just moments of emotional vulnerability. The romantic side of their relationship is characterized by this constant push and pull that is narratively compelling and the result of fun, crunchy character traits to a point, but eventually it just becomes actually frustrating without any payoff. Their season 1 build-up culminates in a love confession from Nathan that is inelegant and a little too honest to be straightforwardly sweet, but it works. The imperfections make it all the more touching, and if it was actually romantic, it wouldn't feel like Nathan. Kelly's brainwashed when he delivers it, so she doesn't remember any of it, but she clearly reciprocates based on her reaction to Nathan's death, and once he comes back, the two of them talk about things and actually make their mutual attraction expressly known in the first episode of season 2. They are attracted to each other. They know that. They both want to pursue a relationship. They make plans to do so. Why are they never together? Nonsense contrivances, that's why. They have a conversation about being into each other and decide to hook up that night. Stupid plot stuff leads to a misunderstanding and they get in a fight and it doesn't happen. It looks like they might get together the next episode, but interesting plot stuff gets in the way and they get in a fight instead. They go on what is very clearly a date-adjacent outing building up to them actually getting together, and then fucking weird mind control plot stuff gets in the way and they get in a fight instead. 3 times. 3 times. Once, yeah, it could have been a nice way of building tension and making the payoff more meaningful, but 3 times in as many episodes, and for the payoff that Kelly actually thinks dating him would be weird and they work better as friends? Really? There is a way to do that conclusion that would be interesting and narratively satisfying, but this way, for this couple, it feels like a frustrating letdown. The last episode, she said that sometimes she thinks she fucking loves him. She enjoyed his dumb little sunblock striptease thing somehow, and now she says he's like her cousin. She made him chicken nuggets. He kissed her cheek, and this is how you end it?
Mate, Sha.
Yeah, mates. Big buddies. Pals.
Okay, being fair. There is actually more than just nonsense plot contrivances that prevents them getting together. Nathan clearly likes Kelly a lot, and that clearly continues after Kelly said she'd rather be friends, but he's pretty bad at actually expressing that in a way that allows for closeness. Look at him in Season 2, Episode 3. He and Kelly aren't even officially together, but Vince is being a little flirty, so Nathan needlessly antagonizes him while also trying to get Kelly's attention. I know why he's doing it. He's got a crush on her and he wants her to pay attention to him, but God, he's so bad at this. Kelly's insecurity and consequence defensiveness and Nathan's easily wounded ego together play off each other to exacerbate otherwise easily overcome moments of conflict. The arguments in episodes 1 and 2 of Season 2, though facilitated by some element of the plot, are the product of existing character traits and flaws that would likely result in conflict between them eventually regardless. If Nathan says something that bothers Kelly, she gets defensive, and he interprets it as rejection. If Kelly says something that gets to Nathan, he lashes out and generally escalates things. They're not all that great at talking to each other. Kelly says, after they've resolved the misunderstanding in episode 1, that despite making up, Nathan's insensitivity is still something that gets to her, and Nathan responds saying he can change. And he means it. I defy anyone to say he is not totally sincere in that moment. But he probably won't. He is, at his core, resistant to any personal change in himself, and Kelly knows that. She still likes him, she still wants to give it a shot, but she does kind of know it wouldn't work out long term, and That is heartbreaking. They still should have been together, though. Not permanently. They would get together at the end of season 2, episode 1, and then in episode 2... No, hear me out. I have a...
Unit 2, Relationships, Lesson 3, Out-of-Group Dating.
As we leave the realm of intergroup dating, temporarily, and look at the romantic relationships our main characters form with people not on community service, there are 3 main relationships worth discussing. And, interestingly, of those, 2 of them also provide the endgame pairings for the characters involved. The other would have if there was any justice in this world, which I guess is as good a segue as any into getting into talking about Curtis and Nikki. I adore Nikki. She is a rare example of a character who gets introduced in her own storyline, which is only tangential to the main group, and so gets development in her own right before being folded into the main plot.
Nikki and Curtis's relationship works really well. I've already covered the start of it to an extent while discussing Curtis and Alisha, but I really like that there's kind of this uncertainty to how it's framed at first. Curtis's brief experience of the future means that we're introduced to Nikki without totally knowing who she'll end up being in the story, but knowing that she will be important, or at least continue to be involved. And Curtis's initial decision to seek her out on his own after the group meets her is not explicitly romantic. He just wants more information. But also, both he and the audience know that there is a point in the future where he and Nikki kiss, so there's this undercurrent of wondering if he'll cheat on Alisha and how we'll feel about it if he does. It's engaging. It works. In terms of Nikki and Curtis's specific dynamic and the development of their relationship, there's not much to discuss when it comes to storylines, but I do like how they interact. Curtis tends to take himself pretty seriously, and Nikki doesn't really let him, which is nice to see. She also doesn't take any shit, which is great when she starts fitting into the group a bit more. Her storyline, which involves her getting a heart transplant and with it inheriting the power of teleportation, means we also get to see Curtis introducing someone to the storm and powers, and I honestly think that of the group, he's the best suited to be in that position. When he gets over his tendency towards self-involvement that's tied up in his self-pity, he is one of the more compassionate members of the group, and it's nice to see that come through on a small scale. Curtis and Nikki's relationship reaches the point where they're quite comfortable with each other pretty quickly, though part of that is that of the 3 episodes where they're properly together, one of those takes place after a time skip. But yeah, they clearly work really well together, and I like it. They're into each other, they have good banter, both of them kind of need a relationship that's just normal, or as normal as they can get after their own respective periods of upheaval. Plus, the show never pits Nikki and Alisha against each other. There's a bit of mild awkwardness at first, but it gets pretty quickly smoothed over by Alisha and Nikki having a conversation in episode 6 that, yes, is undone by time travel, but given how they act around each other in the Christmas special, either they had a similar conversation in the new version of events, or with time the awkwardness goes away.
It is an absolute crime that Nikki dies. Not even that she dies, but that she stays dead. Narratively, yes, there needs to be something that happens to make them all realize they need to get their powers back. And after season 2, episode 6, an episode that culminated in a lot of characters dying, including Nikki, using her death for emotional weight before bringing her back with time travel 2 episodes in a row would feel a little cheap. I get that having Curtis's power around after episode 6 is always going to feel like a bit of a cop-out, not to mention making it seem kind of overpowered. Once you've undone an entire episode's worth of events, there's nowhere you can really go to top yourself. And yes, Misfits is a show where characters die and get killed enough that it is a running joke how often they murder their probation workers, so when those deaths are given emotional weight, they stand out more. But I'm still mad that Nikki died. She died to move the plot along and to motivate the main characters, particularly Curtis, in a pretty clear-cut example of fridging, and she is never once mentioned after that point. Curtis held his dying girlfriend in his arms, and in season 3, he's nonchalantly serving drinks from the exact place he was standing when she got shot. Nikki's death has always sucked, but in writing this, I had the thought that if she'd lived, she could have easily become the 5th main character after Robert Sheehan left, and just... Can you imagine a whole season with Nikki there? Howard, why do you do these things to me?
Nathan and Marnie are fine. Marnie is introduced in the Christmas special and ends up being essentially a part of Nathan's off-screen happy ending if you don't watch Vegas Baby, or his on-screen ambiguously unhappy one if you do. She and Nathan are kinda cute, I suppose. They immediately yes-and each other during their first meeting, which is fun. Pretty much every interaction between them is simultaneously sweet and just a bit weird, and that's clearly what the show's going for, so I can't fault it. they work in their own odd way.
Robert Sheehan's departure from the show was announced in April of 2011, well after season 2 had finished airing, and since then, Sheehan has said that he decided to leave the show before production finished on season 2. I don't know when in relation to the writing and filming of season 2 he made that decision, or at what point he would have made that decision known to the rest of the team. And despite the fact that I've been talking about it like it's a standalone thing, the Christmas special is essentially just the final episode of season 2. It was filmed with the rest of the season, and it only aired 3 days after season 2, episode 6. Basically, I can't say if the Christmas special was written or rewritten with the knowledge that Sheehan would be leaving the show, and the existence of Vegas Baby suggests that maybe it wasn't, but perhaps just because I know that it's his last episode, it does kind of feel like Marnie is there to provide a way of writing Nathan off. Like, Marnie's fun, but she feels a little too much like she was written just to match up well with Nathan, unlike Nikki or Seth, who feel a lot more fleshed out as characters, even if they do end up primarily being love interests. That said, Nathan and Marnie do work. They're funny and weird and cute in their own way, and as much as they don't really make me feel anything, I'm fine with it. Why not?
Seth is introduced as a plot device, essentially. Watching the Christmas special, you likely wouldn't guess that he'd return in season 3, let alone provide a substantial subplot for Kelly. They have interactions with each other as early as the first episode of the season, but they don't start to be clearly romantic right away. When they do, Kelly is always initiating it, but Seth is into her too. He's just somewhat conflicted since he's still trying to find a way to bring Shannon back from the dead. The only reason he starts seeing Kelly is because he all but gives up on the possibility of finding a power that will resurrect Shannon, and so he decides to try to start moving on. Through that lens, the zombie episode becomes about trying to hold on to a past that is clearly gone and about overcoming baggage while pursuing new connections, which is interesting in a season that largely disregards the more metaphorical side of its speculative elements. Aside from that, Seth and Kelly's relationship is interesting because of their conflicting moral perspectives. As mentioned, Kelly is increasingly interested in doing the right thing and in taking action to help other people or prevent bad things happening. Seth, in contrast, is a pretty amoral person when we meet him. He has no interest in what people are going to do with the powers he sells them as long as they have money, and he has no qualms about ripping people off if he can get away with it. He sells powers that have the potential to be harmful and dangerous without a second thought, and Kelly rightly calls him out on the fact that doing so is irresponsible, especially as the group keeps having run-ins with people who use their powers in ways that negatively affect others. Kelly calling him out changes Seth's perspective, and he ends up quitting dealing altogether in a decision that both reflects that Seth cares about Kelly and their relationship and shows that Kelly's morality is rubbing off on him.
If I'm being honest, I don't care about Seth. The beginning and end of my feelings about him and Kelly are that Kelly deserves good things, and that if she's gonna be with someone, it should be with someone who makes her happy, so good for her. Oh, she's into this guy Seth? Good for her. They're flirting? Good for her. They have a date? He's quitting dealing for her? They're talking about going traveling together? Good for her. I love Kelly, and I wish I had more to say about this relationship, but I just don't. She seems happy. Good for her.
Unit 2, Relationships, Lesson 4, Simon and Alisha. To watch Season 2 and 3 of Misfits is to watch the story of Simon and Alisha. The story of a relationship done out of order for both people involved. To conclude your watch of Misfits with the end of Season 3 is to center their story, to allow the close of their loop to form the close of the story of the show, and to sit in the bittersweet ending that it provides. Simon and Alisha are in love.
They are in love. They love each other, and they're perfect together, and their relationship is an event loop of falling in love and each dying in the other's arms, and it breaks my heart every time. Every time. The more you think about their relationship, the more pain it causes you. I love it. Effective tragedy, well written. In discussing Simon and Alisha's relationship, we're not actually talking about one relationship. We're talking about 3. They're together twice, once for about 2 weeks and once for about 6 months, but the first of those 2 relationships is one thing to Alisha and a very different thing to Simon. Arguably, during the main time they're together, the 6 months from just after the end of their community service to Season 3, Episode 8, they also have fairly different perspectives on what their relationship is, but I don't see that as distinct enough to delineate into 2 relationships for the sake of the framework I'm applying. For the majority of that time, they're on as close to the same page as they can be, and while Alicia's past with Simon's future self is relevant, it's not nearly as large a gulf as when time travel is involved directly.
The first of these three relationships, in the order in which they are encountered by the audience, is Alicia's relationship with future Simon. As I've mentioned, Alisha is our point of view character for most of the future Simon storyline, and that, combined with the fact that watching the show in order the audience knows nothing about the future he's coming from, means that we see him as Alisha sees him. To her, he may as well be an entirely different person than the Simon she knows, so she's getting to know him as though he's a new person, complicated by the fact that he already knows everything about her. Their relationship provides Alisha with an intimacy she does not have anywhere else in her life, and possibly has never had in this way, and that's what I want to discuss in terms of her perspective on the first time they're together. Future Simon is immune to other people's powers, and so is able to touch Alisha. For the first time in months, Alisha is able to safely touch another person, and that is unquestionably a factor in why she falls for him. I know how that sounds, but it's not just because of the sex. Alisha has had to spend months being careful in a way she's never had to before. She's had to think about her power constantly around other people, so being around future Simon has gotta be a relief. It gives her an opportunity to let her guard down, to relax. Also, she hasn't touched anyone for more than a couple seconds since season 1, episode 3. She is almost certainly touch-starved, and you can see in the writing and performances that future Simon being able to touch her is as much about non-sexual intimacy as it is about the fact that they could have sex if they so chose.
You touch me like that and then you tell me you have to go.
Like that is sweet and caring, almost reverential. It speaks to an emotional connection that he remembers having with her future self and communicates his love for her. And also, yeah, they have sex. That's something that matters to her, and that she quite possibly thought she'd never be able to have in a relationship ever again, so it's part of what makes this relationship significant. There is also the matter of emotional intimacy. In her relationship with Curtis, Alisha starts to get better at talking about her feelings and having serious relationships, but her relationship with future Simon is a speedrun for that. A week and a half after meeting him, she's cradling his body in her arms and telling him she loves him. Part of this is that he is behaving toward her as though they already have a level of intimacy present in a months-long relationship, but it's also that Simon generally does not allow for cynicism or ironic detachment or casually laughing off serious matters. He is upfront and earnest to a fault. Future Simon in particular pairs this with a level of confidence and certainty in himself. Unlike his past self, he's not easily flustered, meaning that we get moments like this.
Ever since I traveled back from the future.
Really? Did you?
Yes.
All of that, and probably the fact that their relationship is secret and private, results in Alisha being drawn into a lot more emotional honesty than is typical for her, continuing her down the path she started in her relationship with Curtis. Despite its brevity, Alisha's relationship with future Simon has the feeling of being more serious than her relationship with Curtis. Alisha and Curtis never say they love each other, they never plan to travel together, they generally seem to follow a much more normal pace. And future Simon is possibly the first time Alicia's ever been in love, given what we know about her relationship history prior to dating Curtis. The 2 weeks she knows future Simon are intense and passionate and life-changing. And then he dies, and all she's left with is a Simon who is but a pale shadow of the man he will become. The second of the two relationships between Simon and Alisha is the one that is actually a substantive relationship, with all the mundanity and work those involve. We never actually see them get together, though we see what is clearly preamble to that in Season 2, Episode 6. It gets undone, but a similar version of it presumably plays out not long after they finish their community service. We only see Simon and Alisha as an established couple, and one that works well together. They're caring and mutually supportive, they clearly have a lot of trust and next to no insecurity about each other, and there's a level of casual comfort in each other's presence that comes through in the background or in small moments. A lot of their dynamic in Season 3 bears some resemblance to that between Alisha and future Simon in Season 2, but it's not identical. They both feel a little more relaxed, Simon feels less serious, but the closeness between them is comparable, and it's easier to see the similarities between Simon and his future self. Given that for the first 3 months or so of their relationship, Simon and Alisha cannot touch each other, it is worth comparing that time to her relationship with Curtis. When we first see them together in the Christmas special, there's a small moment that establishes both what it means for them to be constantly aware of that barrier, and also the ease with which they're used to navigating it.
Show me.
They're both living in future Simon's former lair, and it seems like they might be sharing a bed, though it's unclear what, if any, precautions they take in doing so. We don't get any concrete information on what, if anything, they do in compensation for not being able to physically have sex. However, I don't think they're engaging in mutual masturbation the way Alisha and Curtis were, mostly because of this scene.
Have you been wanking?
Let's say it a bit louder.
What?
Why are you here?
What, you think I was watching him wank?
That's what you used to do.
They may, though. It's never specified. Alisha does miss having sex with Simon, or his future self at least, and the two are quick to become physically intimate once she gets rid of her power. Also, once they are able to touch in Season 3, there is so much casual contact between the two of them. It's never explicitly discussed or commented on, but it retroactively makes you more aware what Alicia's power took from her and how much easier things are for her day to day without it when it comes to small things, not just the obvious downsides.
Things are not entirely good all the time between Simon and Alisha, but the major cause of conflict between them is Simon's future as and Alicia's past with future Simon, so I'm going to hold off on getting into the details on that. There is something to be said about a relationship where one of them is motivated by regaining the past, and once it is regained by maintaining the present, and where the other is motivated by moving toward the future. They are not necessarily incompatible as perspectives, but in this context they are, and even at their best, Simon and Alisha are never perfect. Future Simon's presence hangs over them, complicating things. Which brings us to the third relationship, which is also the same as the first. Time travel!
Future Simon's relationship with Alisha, when viewed from his perspective, is a very different beast than when viewed from hers. For him, Alisha has just died, and he is given a chance to see her again and have more time with her, but a version of her who does not yet love him. A version who is not the one he's been in a relationship with for all these months. From that perspective, future Simon's reserve and mystery come across as protecting himself, and you can almost feel him holding himself back from what he really wants to be doing, moving slowly and cautiously instead. I don't know how much of the reason for Simon traveling back in time Howard Overman had planned while writing Season 2, or how much of that he would have told you and Rayan, so maybe it's just projection or wishful thinking, but to me, on rewatches, there is something in his performance that carries the grief he must be feeling. Moreover, as mentioned earlier, to him, this is a continuation of an existing relationship rather than the start of a new one. Alicia's falling in love with him, experiencing the beginning of their story. He is at the end. He's entering this with 6 months of relationship behind him, much of which they spent living together, and that carries across to how he treats her. Not to mention the fact that he knows how this ends. He knows exactly how long he gets with her before he dies, and exactly how much of that will be watching from the shadows and how much, or rather how little, will be spent actually with Alisha, being with her again after watching her die in his arms and burying her body in the woods. All of that absolutely informs his actions and attitudes while in the past, and the only reason he's able to be so composed about it is because he is so focused on the mission he has ahead of him, and he's spent so long building up the idea of his destiny and idealizing it for himself.
Which I guess means it's time to talk about time travel and relationships. In my last video, I discussed the imbalance time travel creates in romantic relationships when one person is time traveling and the other is not. In one iteration of the script for that video, I actually used Simon and Alisha as an example, but I ended up cutting it for time and to keep the focus where I wanted it. And because in writing it, I realized I had more to say about them than would work in the context of a video primarily about something else. Simon and Alisha are an excellent example of ways that a text can present the imbalance that time travel creates as negative without going as far as Time Freak does to comment on the implications for agency. This is because, in addition to just being well written, the events of Misfits means that the imbalance of information goes both ways, depending on which point of Simon and Alicia's relationship you're looking at.
When Alisha meets future Simon, he tells her information about their future, about her future, that she has no way of verifying, and that, quite frankly, doesn't sound particularly plausible from her side of things. He could be lying, and the fact that he isn't doesn't change the fact that it's unsettling for Alisha. The very fact of knowing what happens next puts him in a position of power in their relationship. And Alisha says as much.
You fall in love with me.
You can't say stuff like that. You know what happens, and I don't know how I'm supposed to feel, and it's freaking me out.
She's right to be confused and conflicted. It makes sense.
I don't even know if what you're telling me is true. Say all these things. Tell me I fall in love with you. How do I know it happens?
Simon handles this pretty much the best way he could, but he is here to deliberately get Alisha to fall in love with him, among other things, and he's not afraid to make use of the information he has at his disposal. He's just upfront with Alisha about having that information. It works out for the best, but the imbalance is there. After future Simon's death, the tables are turned, because now Alicia's in possession of information Simon is not, and once again the show realistically depicts the reaction this would elicit from the person with less information. The sequence in Season 2, Episode 6 that starts when Alisha is in Nathan's hotel room and covers Alisha and Simon's conversation in future Simon's apartment contains some of my favorite scenes in the show, and it's a shame that they're erased from ever happening. I'm discussing them because it tells us something about Simon's initial feelings upon learning about his future self, and because their presence in the episode 7 previously on implies that enough of the same information was conveyed for the new version of events to be similar. Alisha, during those two scenes, quotes something that the present version of Simon never actually said, has a photo of the two of them that has yet to be taken, and tells Simon all sorts of information about things that will happen to him because they have already happened and she was there for them. And it freaks him out. Alisha, through knowing future Simon, has information Simon does not. Not only about the part of his life during which she was with future Simon, but also the future generally, not to mention information about him that he doesn't know she has. When Simon hears her say that he said community service was the best time of his life, he hasn't said that to anyone in the community service group, but he's likely thought it, given that he says it to the group at the end of the episode. If he hasn't thought it, he's definitely felt it without articulating in as many words that it's what he was feeling. Alisha is attributing to him a real thought and feeling that he presently has, but which he has never expressed out loud. Unlike future Simon, Alisha does misuse the imbalance of information between her and Simon. In the Christmas episode, she lies to him and says that his future self told her they got rid of their powers, and this is framed as messed up. She's manipulating her boyfriend in a way that she knows will work because he feels beholden to his future self and the idea of his destiny, and she uses that to get him to do something he doesn't want to do. Simon is upset about it, and Alisha apologizes, so they do make up, but it's a good illustration of the imbalance present in their relationship earlier on. The imbalance in information becomes less relevant in Season 3, but in the Christmas special it combines with the way that Alisha will talk about future Simon to highlight the distance between Alicia's experience of their relationship and Simon's.
We had great sex. I miss having sex with you.
So here's a question. When did Simon start having feelings for Alisha? Both Simon and Alisha experience being told that they're going to fall in love with the other at a point when that is not currently how they feel. Alisha from future Simon, and Simon from Alisha after future Simon's death. Following Alisha in the future Simon storyline, we know that she has no such feelings for the present version of Simon, and we watch her develop them for future Simon. Simon, however, we see him learn about it in events that get undone, and then we get a time skip to after he and Alisha have started dating. As a very arrow teenager, I was somewhat unsure if that meant that Simon had liked Alisha for a while, or if he'd only started dating her because he knew he was supposed to, and then happened to develop feelings for her. On rewatches, I think there are actually a number of things that could easily be clues that Simon has a crush on Alisha as early as the start of Season 2. Though no feelings strong enough for him to be bothered by Alisha dating Curtis, or for him to avoid pursuing other relationships. However, I do think that Simon would start dating Alisha because he felt like he was supposed to. We get very clear textual confirmation that Simon believes he has to fulfill the path set out for him, and that is one of the saddest things about his and Alicia's relationship.
There are 2 episodes in Season 3 that deal with this, both of which I mentioned while discussing character development, though not in detail. In Episode 3, we meet a clear parallel for Simon in Peter, and the episode explores Simon's fascination with his destiny and believing he needs to fulfill it. He and Peter both idealize and glamorize having a destiny at all, and the fact that said destiny involves being a superhero and dying heroically. This comes into direct conflict with what Alisha wants. She doesn't want him to go back in time at all, because she wants their relationship to last, not to mention that she had to watch him die. His death is heroic and admirable to him. To her, it's just the sad, painful reality of someone she loves dying. She outright states this in episode 3.
I don't want you to become him.
Because she wants him to stay with her. All Simon wants is to become his future self. He loves Alisha and he's happy being with her, but he's fixated on becoming the version of himself she first fell in love with, the version of himself who was a superhero, and now Alisha's telling him not to. But of course she is. They started dating after she lost him once. She doesn't want it to happen again. The Peter episode is interesting on so many levels because it's an examination of the superhero tropes in which Simon's been living. Peter's power comes from his love of comics and allows anything he draws to come true, and he uses this to control Simon and the events of the entire episode. Peter makes Simon into a superhero, and that's not a good thing. Misfits has always been a show about undermining superheroes, about asking what if the people with powers were neither particularly super nor heroic, and the tension between their circumstances and any attempts to be heroic at all despite this. As Simon has gotten closer to actually being a hero, the show uses this episode to focus on more specific tropes of the genre, and what it means that Simon's idea of heroism is so rooted in superhero media. The most obvious example of this is its takedown of the heroic self-sacrificing breakup, which, if you watched my Time Freak video, you'll know is a trope I'm not a fan of. Under Peter's influence, Simon breaks up with Alisha, and the episode depicts this from Alisha's perspective, showing it as a cruel, unexplained decision that comes out of nowhere in what she thought was a positive relationship. The episode also subtly challenges Simon's perspective on the heroism of his eventual death, and the desirability of a heroic death at all. There's nothing overt, it's largely in the framing. Watching Simon smiles as he tells Peter about his destiny, about dying, feels a little sinister. Peter orchestrating his own death, contriving his own necessary end, and Simon and Alisha's attitudes while dealing with it, things like that. The really interesting part of this episode, though, is the issue of free will, which also ties into episode 8. Simon believes in the immutability of his fate. He knows what's going to happen, and it needs to happen so that he and Alisha get together, so that his friends don't die, so that his present will look the way it does. Alisha, much less versed in genre fiction and the workings of time travel, doesn't think that's necessary. What's happened has happened, and it can't unhappen just because Simon never travels back in time. That's a central argument between them in Season 3, Episode 3, and it concludes with Simon agreeing not to go back in time. However, that isn't possible. The time travel that Simon uses is fixed timeline. He is living on a set path which he is unable to change. Episode 3, aside from the obvious matter of dealing with free will when it comes to Peter controlling the actions of other characters, is the first hint at confirming that even when not actively pursuing his destiny, Simon cannot change his fate. Probably. Simon telling Alisha that he wouldn't ever go back in time was drawn in advance by Peter, as was Simon keeping his parkour superhero gear despite his promise to Alisha to burn it. It was Peter's way of ensuring that Simon would carry out his destiny, and Peter wouldn't have tried to do that had Simon not told him about his time travel destiny. Is Simon's destiny predetermined because of the nature of the universe in which Misfits exist, and the specific powers Simon uses to time travel, or because of his own actions? This is also a major element of Season 3, Episode 8, when Simon seeing a vision of something makes him believe he's supposed to do it, that the event is not one to be avoided but to go through with. We know from previous episodes that Simon's visions can be averted. In fact, they have almost entirely appeared as warnings about things which should be avoided, and yet Simon leans into this one. Simon, as a character, is consistently someone who makes the choice to lean into destiny and fate, to try and fulfill what he knows will happen, and that, in itself, is a kind of tragedy. If he had tried to defy what was meant to happen, would he and Alisha have had a shot at a happy ending?
The answer is no, but the glimmer of hope that perhaps they could have found a way out makes the self-confirming bittersweet time loop and tragedies of their individual deaths all the more affecting. However, what I believe to be the biggest tragedy in Simon and Alisha's relationship is that as much as they love each other, as much as they are really good together, neither Simon nor Alisha is ever quite in the version of their relationship that they want to be in. They get close for most of Season 3, but they're never quite there. When Alisha is first with future Simon, he's not with the version of her he's been with for months. He's with an earlier version, a version who doesn't even love his present self. After future Simon's death, Alisha starts to try to get to know Simon, but it's clear that she's only doing it because she's grieving his future self and wants to try to recapture some of that relationship she's lost. You can see that, regardless of her reasons, she does start to care about this present version of him too, but the fact that she fell in love with his future self first is still there. Simon knows it, too. He's always trying to live up to that, always aware that he's not the same person as his future self.
I hate thinking about you being with him. You'll always love him more than you love me.
With that in mind, Alicia's words to him as he dies are all the more painful.
I don't love him. I love you.
That is simultaneously confirmation of everything he's believed for months, that Alisha loved his future self more, and a victory, because now he's finally gotten to be that person, the one she loves more. But he's getting that from less than 2 full weeks with a version of her that hasn't even experienced the majority of their relationship as he knows it. Heartbreaking.
Unit 3. The Weird Stuff. Lesson 1. The Problematic and Harmful.
Let's shift gears a little and talk about some of the more out there aspects of Misfits. Look, Misfits is a weird show. It's a good show, and I like it, but it has some truly baffling stuff that happens over the course of the plot, often integral to the main plot in a way that means you must pay attention to it and allow it to occupy space in your brain. The things I've chosen to group together in this category cover a lot of ground, ranging from, oh right, this was made in 2009, to, I think I get what you're going for, but it's a little ambiguous, to, oh well, that has some truly troubling and harmful implications that are not examined, to, what the fuck?
Hey, Todd? What the fuck?
Most of this section will be dealing with specific plot lines and their implications, but I want to open it with a general acknowledgement of the casual transphobia, ableism, and homophobia that show up throughout the show. The ableism and transphobia mostly show up in the form of small comments, including slurs and jokes, though there are occasionally things that have a little more involvement with the plot. A lot of the comments will come from Nathan, and in general, a lot of what Nathan says is framed as being inappropriate, and that the rest of the characters know it. However, the show doesn't seem to quite categorize the ableism and transphobia the same way. On the other hand, when Nathan makes homophobic jokes or comments, the show does seem to frame it as inappropriate, but the show as a whole isn't great at queer representation. Some of that is just the absence of queer main characters, aside from Abby in seasons 4 and 5, and even that's complicated. Some of it is questionable choices with the few queer characters who do show up. Speaking of queer characters,
I actually think that Emma is handled surprisingly well for a character whose bisexuality is largely a plot device. No one's explicitly weird about her being bi, and she's not just flat stereotypes. The sex scenes between her and Mel aren't shot particularly differently from other sex scenes, which is definitely something. Plot of the episode as a whole, and the Mel-Emma-Curtis love triangle specifically, seems to be more interested in the titillating aspects of the situation than in anything else, and that is only possible if Emma is bisexual. Essentially, her sexuality serves the same narrative function as Curtis's power. At no point is Curtis's power ever used to explore gender identity or presentation in a way that reflects any actual curiosity toward those topics. There is very little to talk about from a trans perspective, or even from a broadly queer perspective, deconstructing what masculinity and femininity mean. At most, you could make a connection to the transphobic talking point of men pretending to be women to get into women's spaces, but there's not really much to say. The show certainly doesn't lean into the transphobia behind that concern, but not because it's trans-accepting, just because it's entirely disinterested in most of the topics involved in that interpretation. And that gets to what I personally find disappointing about this episode. It's not actually all that interested in queerness or exploring gender identity or sexuality.
So she is a lesbian?
I don't think there's an official term for this shit.
It's trying to be feminist.
I feel like I can't keep talking about this episode without making some kind of counter-recommendation of a story that's actually interested in queerness, so watch Femme. Nathan Stewart Jarrett plays a drag queen, and it's an interesting look at queerness and masculinity. It can be a rough watch, so proceed with caution, take care of yourself, but it's a lot more deliberate in its handling of serious subject matter than Misfits, and does so in a way that meaningfully explores nuance.
The plot of Season 3, Episode 2, is basically cis man experiences misogyny. It's not done well.
You have no idea what it's like to be a woman. What?
You've got your period.
On the one hand, yes, someone consistently perceived as a woman will have a different experience moving through the world than someone consistently perceived as a man. If somebody goes from presenting as one binary gender to presenting as the other binary gender, they will often notice a change in how people treat them. Trans 101. But, okay. There are two parts to the shortcomings of this episode. The first is that it's fairly simplistic and doesn't go much beyond sexual harassment and assault happen to women. And the second is that Curtis didn't need to learn this lesson. I'm not saying that he was Feminist of the Year or anything, but he was pretty good at least commenting on Nathan's shittiness.
The girls, like, do they ever say in this?
And nothing about how he's interacted with women or just generally comported himself makes it seem like he was really ignoring or perpetuating the sexism that women around him face. If it was done differently, there could be something to the fact that even a man who seems generally chill and unsexist cannot fully understand the experience women have moving through the world if he's never lived it. But it's not doing that. It really does just feel like Curtis is learning sexism exists. And then there's the matter of sexual assault. We're going to be talking about this topic for a while, so in case you haven't checked the description yet or needed the reminder, skip ahead to this time code to get past it. One of the characters in the episode is the coach of the women's running group, and he roofies first Mel, then Emma in an attempt to rape them. Curtis comes to enough to get away before anything happens, and he intervenes to help Emma when it happens to her. The episode unambiguously frames the coach's actions as malicious and wrong, and Curtis and Emma ensure that he gets comeuppance for that. I am personally okay with that as a storyline that happens in a fictional work. It's clear on what it's doing and why the events are a part of this story. Unfortunately, that is not the norm for how the show handles sexual assault, particularly sexual assault against men.
That same episode, while Curtis as Mel is under the effects of the roofie, but before the coach finds him, Rudy finds Mel. Thinking he's Emma, Curtis makes Rudy go down on him. Obviously, Curtis was not in a mental state to consent, but Rudy later says in the episode that he didn't want to do it. The fact that he did it at all is played as a joke. On the whole, Misfits is not a show that's great at handling the matter of sexual assault. It'll have things like the episode we've been discussing, where it is clearly depicting it as something which is wrong and harmful, and then it'll have moments where it just sort of casually has characters think about perpetrating assault and move on without really examining it. Like, I think this is meant to be part of Simon being weird and lonely early on, but why is this here? Are we meant to condemn Simon for this? Are we meant to condemn him for creeping on Alisha and Kelly getting changed? I certainly don't like that it happens, and Alisha and Kelly are having a conversation that develops both their friendship and the two of them as individuals, but the camera is preoccupied with their bodies to the point that it feels like it's condoning Simon's actions. Or things like this.
I'll just slip it in there and give her a little sleepy fog. That's right.
That feels a lot more serious than Rudy's other unpleasant qualities. But even in cases where it is framed with troubling ambivalence, it generally feels like the show is aware that the stuff it's depicting is assault when it's perpetrated against women. When it's perpetrated against men, it's rarely treated as assault at all. In Season 2, Episode 1, Lucy shapeshifts into Alisha and gives Simon a blowjob, during which he repeatedly tries to tell her not to. At no point does the rest of the episode frame this as assault.
You didn't know it wasn't Alisha. You should have stopped her.
He did. He tried to stop her, and she continued anyway. That is assault. If you want to get really technical, even if he had consented, it wouldn't be to what he thought he was consenting to, given that it was Lucy, not Alisha. But that's irrelevant given that he didn't consent in the first place. 2 episodes later, Simon is getting assaulted again, this time by Nathan. Now, given that Nathan is under the influence of a tattoo which has brainwashed him, he is not in his right mind, and it can't be considered consensual on his part either. But still. Both sides of this are played for laughs. It's funny that Nathan's being mind-controlled into being gay, and it's funny that he's kissing Simon who doesn't want him to. That scene also brings up the other trend in how Misfits portrays sexual assault against men, specifically in terms of older women pursuing younger men. Nathan tells a story about one of his mother's friends assaulting him when he was a teenager and treats it like it's a story of sexual conquest. There are 3 storylines in the first 3 seasons of Misfits that deal with an older woman engaging in a relationship with a younger man, though, unlike Nathan's story, the men are all adults. In 2 of those cases, the women in question are in positions of power and are abusing that power. When Rudy's therapist starts a relationship with Rudy too and comes on to Rudy, it's never addressed that her actions are unethical. If this were a middle-aged man and a woman in her early 20s, it would not at all be framed the same way, and it makes me deeply uncomfortable that because Rudy's a man and his therapist is a woman, we're meant to see this as either fine or just a little weird because she's old and old women are gross, depending on if you favor Rudy 2's or Rudy's framing of it. The fact that she should not be doing this with a patient is never brought up. And then there's Sally. Sally's relationship with Simon forms a major subplot throughout the first season, and unlike Rudy and his therapist, the show does clearly frame at least some of her actions as unethical. The fact that she catfishes him, for instance, the fact that she is using him for information. However, I'm not sure to what extent her engaging in a romantic relationship with him is supposed to be seen as something unethical because she's his probation worker, and to what extent it should be taken as bad just because she's doing so duplicitously. She is not actually interested in Simon, but she sees that he's lonely and not really part of the rest of the group yet, and in that, he is vulnerable. She befriends him online as Shy Girl 18 and slowly gets closer to him in person to try and learn what she can about what happened to Tony. She is the villain of Season 1 because of the threat she poses to the group, and in such, her actions are presented as sinister. But because of her motivations, rather than the actions themselves. Watching it as a teenager, I can't quite remember what I thought of the romance plot between Simon and Sally. I think I remember being vaguely weirded out by it, but I don't think that's a reliable recollection. Now, as an adult, I spend the whole time bristling during their scenes. Sally's actions are so clearly calculated to make Simon trust her, and she deliberately exploits his insecurities and the fact that he doesn't really have any friends. She sees how Nathan and the rest of the group treat him and uses it to her advantage. Simon is young and inexperienced romantically, and Sally is his probation worker. Because of her job, she has power over him. Regardless of if Sally is genuinely interested in him or not, regardless of her motives, that's a messed up situation. However, I think that the show only sees it as negative because Sally's trying to get information. She makes brief mention of the fact that, as his probation worker, it's inappropriate for her to go out with him, so the show is at least aware that that's a line being crossed, but overall I don't think it expects that to be the audience's takeaway. There are two reasons I think that. The first is how people around Simon react to his relationship with Sally without the context of her ulterior motives.
Fit older woman. Heavy.
Curtis doesn't react to the fact that Sally is Simon's probation worker. The only person to bring it up at all is Sally, and she almost immediately disregards it in what feels like a deliberate, oh, I shouldn't, but I will move. The other reason that I don't think the show is aware of how creepy Sally's actions are, even in the absence of her efforts to use Simon for her investigation, is how Simon frames them, and how the show frames the revelation of her true motives. When Simon finds out that Sally just wanted to try and figure out what happened to Tony, he's hurt, and he feels betrayed, but only because he's learned her feelings for him weren't genuine.
You were just using me.
And part of the pathos of the scene hinges on the audience's feeling bad that Simon has lost what he thought was a genuine relationship. And that only works if we believe the version of their relationship that Simon thought existed was a good one. Simon never frames his relationship with Sally as one with unethical power dynamics, even in Season 3 when Sally comes back as a ghost. And no, not everyone who is in such a relationship will end up framing it as such immediately. They might not be ready to acknowledge it for a very long time. But again, the show presents this uncritically. We are meant to accept Simon's perspective on it. Sally's actions are framed as wrong, but the ambiguity when it comes to separating that from her motivations is deeply frustrating, and it feels irresponsible from a writing perspective.
Hi, editing RJ here, and I feel like I wasn't totally clear enough in the point I'm making when discussing Rudy's therapist and Sally. A character in a piece of media does not have to say out loud, this is an unethical thing, in order for it to be clear that the work knows what it's doing or is being deliberate when portraying messed up or unethical subject matter, or even for the audience to enjoy said subject matter, but the tone and genre have to carry it. NBC's Hannibal is a show that is quite deliberately about a messed up relationship that fans are still really into because the show is deliberately leaning into the messed up power dynamics and the mutual obsession as a way of exploring the potentially alluring aspects of this potentially dangerous and unethical situation. Or even Femme, which was my counter-recommendation for the Curtis Emma episode, is a movie about a relationship that is messed up on a lot of levels. It includes deceit, revenge, violence. Like, there's a lot going on there, and a lot of it is unethical by the framework I've been applying to this show. But the way that the movie handles it, the way the writers and the rest of the team take such great care with how they tell this story, makes it work as a fictional exploration of complicated and challenging topics rather than Misfits, which is a bit of a mess. But Misfits is able to balance that tone when it comes to death. The dark comedy that surrounds the many instances of murder on this show never once leave me thinking that maybe the creators are condoning homicide, but it doesn't quite nail it when it comes to the examples and relationships I'm discussing in this section. The therapist plotline is the comedic relief of the episode it's in. You can tell that from the performances, the music choices, the writing. The Sally and Simon storyline gets close to feeling like a deliberate depiction of a complicated and potentially predatory relationship, but it hews a little too close to treating it like there is uncomplicated and genuine romantic potential between Simon and Sally had Sally only been sincere. Especially in the context of Season 3, Episode 8, and the scenes where the two of them interact when she's come back from the dead. It's just hard to feel like the show is self-aware or making deliberate choices about the kind of material it's depicting, and when the choices do feel deliberate, they feel like they're way too close for comedy for my tastes. So it complicates my enjoyment of the show, and for some storylines removes that enjoyment entirely. The last example in this trend of relationships between older women and younger men, a trend which continues into the later seasons, by the way, is Ruth and Nathan in Season 1, Episode 2. Ruth is 82, but when Nathan meets her, she's been transformed into a young woman by the storm. This one is a lot less cut and dry than the previous example. Obviously, a 70-year age gap means that Ruth and Nathan are at very different places in life, and Ruth exhibits an emotional maturity that Nathan lacks. And not just because he's a generally immature individual. But Ruth and Nathan, when they meet, are effectively equals, and I don't know that I can point to anything that Ruth's doing that a reasonably mature woman who was actually in her early 20s wouldn't, aside from the details of some of her advice to him. Unlike the first two examples I talked about, it feels more like we're working with vampire rules, you know? As soon as you throw speculative elements into the mix, it changes how you approach it. At a certain point, the lack of information that Nathan has when it comes to Ruth's actual age becomes more of an issue, and I think that it's worth acknowledging that Nathan wouldn't act the way he did if he knew she wasn't actually in her 20s. But it's not a matter of the age gap itself so much as Ruth's choice not to disclose it. My interest in discussing this is more how Nathan reacts when he finds out and how the rest of the group talk about it. Ruth and Nathan have sex, and when they do, Ruth changes back into an old woman. Nathan is scared and runs away.
You're sorry. I'm gonna need counseling now. I'm damaged goods.
To him, this was a negative experience which he was seriously affected by. When the rest of the group find out, they make fun of him.
God's sake. Oh.
Okay, so there's like three different things going on here. One, this feels like an extension of playing a sexual assault against men for a laugh. It's not exactly equivalent to the other instances, but it's very much a product of the same dismissive attitudes. Two, a lot of this feels like the general disgust our society has for older women's sexuality and distaste for the elderly in general. Like, it's very, ew, old people are gross. They could never be considered attractive by anyone, you know? And I don't expect a group of young adults to find people in their 80s attractive to them personally, but the disgust with the concept of older people, particularly older women, and
the idea of them feeling desire or being on the receiving end of that isn't great. 3, the age gap. I know I have just given my opinion on the age gap, but the show is once again very inconsistent about it. Earlier in the episode, an elderly man is affected by Alicia's power, and it's framed as uncomfortable and disturbing for her to be on the receiving end of his interest. An older woman is interested in Nathan, and it's fine. Is this because she's physically young? Because Alicia's power makes people's comments more overtly sexual? Because Ruth's a woman? Nathan is just as, if not more, affected by the fact that he had sex with Ruth as Alisha is by her power accidentally affecting the old man. To him, this is an upsetting experience because of her age. That is, yes, partially because of the show's aforementioned old women are gross attitude, but it's genuinely uncomfortable to watch Nathan be upset and for no one to take him seriously. They comment on the age gap almost exclusively, but it's all either that old women are gross, and this makes Nathan gross by extension, or the implication that Nathan was in some way predatory due to Ruth's age. Were Ruth physically in her 80s when Nathan initiated a relationship with her, that would be a consideration, but she's not. He did not know she was in her 80s. Honestly, the whole storyline is just kind of a mess, and I'm not really sure what to make of it. Once again, the ambiguity of intention on the part of the writing is frustrating. Which, yeah, pretty much leads us to talking about Alicia's power. This is the big one. Alicia's power exists at the intersection between the show's attitude towards sexual assault, its interest in being edgy through using the powers for sex stuff, and the ways that powers reflect personality. It is, by necessity, a massive part of Alicia's character growth and a fairly big part of the show generally, but despite that, it is presented with surprising ambiguity when it comes to just what the show is trying to say about sexuality and Alicia's relationship with it. Alisha, like everyone except Nathan, learns about her power by chance in episode 1, but the first episode that really deals with it in depth is season 1, episode 3. In episode 2, Alisha mentions to Kelly that she hasn't had sex with anyone since getting her power, but at some point between that conversation and the start of episode 3, that changes, as the opening of episode 3 is a montage of Alisha using her power to have sex with guys at clubs. I've mentioned this before when discussing Curtis and Alicia's relationship, but to be perfectly clear, this is rape. Even if they would sleep with her without her power, which we have no way of knowing, they are not in their right minds while under its effects, and they cannot withdraw consent once she's touching them because her power makes them want to have sex with her at all costs. The show knows this, and it is directly addressed in the main plot of the episode when Alisha uses her power on Curtis. Curtis is interested in her, and not hiding it, but he does make it clear that he doesn't want to be influenced by her power. Alisha touches him anyway, and has sex with him. Curtis is rightfully hurt and angry, and the show is on his side.
You can't be doing that to people!
Trust me, you enjoyed it.
That wasn't me!
You were so up for it. You kept telling me how much you wanted to be with me.
When I want to tell you something, I'll tell you myself. You don't know what I'm feeling.
The fact that he and Alisha get together later this episode potentially undermines how serious Alicia's actions were, but the episode is primarily interested in exploring Alicia's relationship with sex, sexuality, and power, and the journey that she goes on in the episode makes it work. To me. Your mileage may vary. For the rest of season 1 and 2, the position that the episode lands on, that Alicia's power shouldn't be used on anyone and is a pretty horrible thing for someone to have, is the consistent position of the show. In the Christmas special, the last episode with Alicia's initial power, Elliot Jesus buying and using Alicia's power is treated with disgust and outrage, though it's framed as slightly more serious when it's Elliot doing it than Alisha, which I'd love to chalk up to her being one of our leads and Elliot being a villain, but does definitely feel like it has as much, if not more, to do with gender as it does with their intentions. However, even if Alicia's deliberate use of her power isn't treated as the same level of threat as Elliot doing the same, in discussing Elliot, the fact that Alisha did the same thing is brought up and not sugar-coated.
We never raped or murdered anyone.
She raped me and we killed loads of people.
But that's just one side of Alicia's power and consent. There's also the times when Alicia's power affects people accidentally. Because Alisha cannot control her power, it happens to anyone who touches her regardless of if she wants it to or not, there are a few times when it essentially forces men into assaulting her. They are not in control of their actions, but Alisha is still on the receiving end of unwanted sexual advances. This happens a couple of times over the course of the first 3 episodes of the show, and they never lead to actual sex. However, the occasions that do get more physical are still obviously distressing to Alisha, and she has to struggle to get away from the person or persons in question. It feels incorrect to say that the men in question are assaulting Alisha because they have no agency over it, but she is being assaulted. Men will try to have sex with Alisha whether she wants them to or not. Though not in the same way, her power impedes Alisha's ability to give or withdraw consent as well. Touching someone is initiating sex, and if she is put into a position where it's not easy for her to physically break contact with them, she can't change that. If you'll remember, the premise of Misfits, really the only rule that the powers follow, is that they are reflections of something about a character's personality. So what exactly does Alisha's power say about her? The first and most obvious thing that Alisha's power is reflecting is the way she is very open with her sexuality and deliberately uses it to her advantage. She wants people to find her attractive. She's owning her sexuality. The Storm gives her a monkey's paw version of what she's already doing with general presentation and behavior, in the same way that Simon and Kelly's powers represent negative interpretations of their current realities. From this lens, the fact that we only ever see men affected by Alisha's power, while she has it at least, becomes a reflection of the fact that the way she presents herself early on is specifically about how she wants men to view her. Her power isn't actually about sex itself, it's about desirability. I'm not saying that I think Alicia's power wouldn't work on women, I think it would, but narratively and from a character perspective, it's more consistent if her power is used on men. Also, I do not trust Howard Overman to write a scene where a woman is affected by Alicia's power without enforcing the predatory lesbian stereotype in some way. The point is, though, that because Alisha is overt with her sexuality and wants to be seen as desirable by men, the Storm extrapolates that to anyone she touches wanting to have sex with her no matter what. And right about now, you're probably starting to think, hey, that sounds a little bit like slut-shaming, if not victim-blaming. And you're right, imaginary audience member. I've constructed for rhetorical purposes to articulate my next point. Alisha is beautiful. That is not my opinion on Antonia Thomas's appearance. It is the position of the show, and her power and character arc early on are interested in interrogating what that means. One of the first answers we get about this is the effect her appearance has on men. In Season 1, Episode 2, Sally witnesses 2 different instances of men influenced by Alicia's power, both without Alisha intending it.
Let me taste your sweet cherry lips. I'd give my life to spend the night between your dusky thighs.
Oh, okay, let's find you a chair.
Oh, I want you so bad. I need your loving, you sexy little wink.
Shit, let go of me!
After the second one, she finds Alisha in the bathroom and they have a conversation in which Sally says this.
You seem to have quite an effect on men. You're a very beautiful girl.
It's not my fault if they can't keep their dicks in their trousers.
Sally doesn't have the context of Alicia's power, but essentially, Alicia's power is reinforcing Sally's perspective. The Storm is victim-blaming Alisha. If she didn't want every man who touched her to be driven mad with lust, she shouldn't have worn such a provocative outfit. The show itself does not frame Sally's response as correct, necessarily, but there is once again a frustrating ambiguity when it comes to the implied reasoning behind Alicia's power. There are, however, 2 other exchanges that provide more insight into what the show is saying about Alicia's beauty. The first is in Season 1, Episode 3, between Alisha and Curtis.
You think because you're beautiful, you can treat people any way you want?
Yeah, that's pretty much how it works. Haven't you figured that out yet?
Because Alisha is attractive, she's able to get what she wants and get away with treating people poorly. So she has become a person who treats people however she wants, knowing that she'll get away with it. To return to the fact that she uses her sexuality for her advantage, she uses how she looks as something that she can use to get what she wants. She's been using sex for power long before she had her actual power. When we meet her, she's inconsiderate and even mean. This is directly addressed in the plot of Episode 3 between her and Curtis, and later in Season 3 when Rudy is introduced. Her power is reflective of the fact that she is willing to use people without regard for their feelings, and in that respect it works quite well as something which spurs her to growth when she has to confront the consequences of her actions and the parts of her feelings that she's trying to avoid. Here's where it gets somewhat dicey, however, in terms of framing. The text of the show frames sex shaming negatively and mostly presents casual sex either neutrally or positively depending on the storyline. However, the subtext of the growth Alisha goes through because of her power goes against that. Alisha, when we meet her, is not used to forming relationships with any intimacy other than physical. The only reason she learns how to form emotional intimacy and engage in serious romantic relationships is that she is unable to rely on physical intimacy. She can't have casual sex anymore, she can't have sex in her relationships, so she has to learn how to make emotional connections. It is framed as a good thing that she does this, and that in doing so she no longer has casual sex. There's nothing wrong with casual sex, but Alisha's character growth taking her away from it is directly tied to the way she grows past all of the genuinely negative parts of where she starts out. The fact that she doesn't care about other people's feelings, the fact that she's using casual connections to avoid having to examine her own emotions. We have at least one concrete example of her knowingly using someone for sex outside of the context of her power in the story with her past with Rudy. And we can take from that, and how she initially uses her power, that she may have used men for sex without clearly communicating that it was casual, and while possibly setting expectations for something more. In that case, yes, there is something wrong with casual sex, not because it is casual, but because the people involved are not all on the same page about what is happening. However, we do not know if that was how Alisha conducted herself all of the time when sleeping with guys at clubs or parties. She clearly did it sometimes.
I told all my friends I was seeing you, you know. And the next day, you looked right through me. I loved you. You wouldn't even look at me.
And she's clearly cheated on past partners.
You're the first person I've been faithful to, and you're cheating on me.
So perhaps we are meant to infer that Alisha was largely disrespectful to her sexual partners. Unfortunately, because her sex life is so connected to the rest of her character growth, and because of the multiple possible readings of the implications of her power, the subtext, intended or not, is that Alisha was kind of a bad person when she was a slut, and she became a better, kinder person when she learned to have monogamous relationships. So that's not great. There is one final facet of the way the show explores Alisha's beauty and how it affects her interactions with the world, and that comes to us from Simon.
Look, if I've ever been a bitch to you, I'm sorry.
I've never thought you were a bitch. Sometimes I think it's difficult for beautiful girls. People don't see past their looks.
To me, this is crucial to making Alisha's character actually work amidst all of the frustratingly unspecific framing surrounding Alisha's power. The sentiment itself is important because it captures that the power Alisha was able to assume pre-Storm by using her sexuality to her advantage through her looks came at the downside of being reduced to just her looks. But more important than the specifics of Simon's line in this scene is the sympathy the narrative has for Alisha as represented in this moment.
Made me feel, ever since I got this power, blokes, you know, doesn't make you feel very good about yourself.
It's not down to you.
The fact that her power reflects how inconsiderate and occasionally cruel Alisha is at the start of the show could easily lead to an unlikable or irredeemable character. Without sympathy for her underlying that, and an interest in exploring why she acts that way, her character would not work. And specifically, without sympathy for the negative aspects of how people react to her appearance and see her because of how she looks, she could easily become a flat stereotype. Here's an idea I wish the show had properly explored. Both Kelly and Alisha's power force them into living with the reality of people's perceptions of them rather than how they see themselves. And both of them specifically hinder their ability to form intimate relationships. And both of their powers are also a net negative for them in a way that none of the male characters' powers are. Depending on how you look at it, Season 1, Episode 3 pretty clearly explores the double-edged sword of Alicia's power. From one perspective, the episode depicts Alicia's attempts to use sex and her power as a distraction, but, like many coping mechanisms, finds it inadequate and harmful to those around her, while her power presents a depiction through a speculative lens of what it's like to be subjected to the mindset that many real people have about women, that she's asking for it, that just by being attractive she is inviting advances. Seen another way, though, the double-edged sword of Alicia's power comes across very differently. She can use it to have power over people and get what she wants, even when it is harmful to the people involved, but it also means that she is more vulnerable to assault. The meaning we can take from this outside the context of the speculative trappings seems to be that taking charge of her sexuality gives Alisha power, but that power is unethical, and the downside is that she runs the risk of encountering situations where men will turn the tables and misuse power over her. By behaving the way she does, Alisha is, in fact, asking for it. I do not think that second implication is intended, based on the rest of the show. But so many of the events surrounding Alicia's power are presented with a lack of specificity that it leaves room for multiple conflicting interpretations in a way that strikes me as poor writing regardless of your perspective on the broader implications of those interpretations. It doesn't matter if I like what you're trying to say or not, I should be able to tell what you're saying. And in terms of the broader implications, the uncomfortable and potentially harmful readings of Alicia's power and the events surrounding it should, I think, be handled with more specificity and clarity than that. And the fact that I have been thinking about this show's framing of Alicia's power on and off for 11 years, and I'm still unable to reach a definitive conclusion about what the show is trying to say with it, means that on some level, the storytellers have failed. Okay, let's move on to something a little less serious.
Unit 3, The Weird Stuff. Lesson 2, What the Fuck?
Most of the true what the fuck moments in Misfits start to come in seasons 4 and 5, as the more normal ideas about possible powers and their consequences are exhausted and the show branches out into stranger and stranger territory. That said, the first 3 seasons are not without their moments. Most of them, honestly, I've discussed in the previous section, since much of what on the surface is what the fuck ends up being connected to something that actually warrants further discussion and analysis related to a more serious topic.
The show very casually confirms that ghosts in the afterlife are real, but that there is no God.
Well, the big news is there's no God.
Which isn't inherently a what the fuck moment, but you would think it would merit slightly more examination than it gets, especially considering the number of people who die and are killed around our main characters, and the fact that Nathan isn't aware of any afterlife during the period between dying and coming back to life. There's also stuff like Nathan's mom's boyfriend, who does not turn into a dog every full moon, but does turn into a human man with the mind of a dog. The storm grants other people fully transformation-based powers. We see the first one of those in the same episode with Jeremy. There's even another animal-human transformation. Why does Jeremy just run around as a naked man? What the fuck? And then there's the fact that an entire episode's A-plot revolves around the ticking clock of preventing Rudy's penis from falling off. Like, there's something to be said about the point of that episode in terms of character development for Rudy, and I do think it's the start of an interesting arc for him that ultimately leads to his relationship with Jess in season 5, but, like, the mechanism for that development is that his penis is literally going to fall off his body.
My cock came off! Yes! Then someone stood on it.
And that same episode is the one where Curtis gets himself pregnant, which is just a lot for one episode. In Season 3, Episode 6, Curtis's power starts malfunctioning to the point that he gets stuck as Mel. He takes a pregnancy test and finds out that he's pregnant, and the only way it could have happened would be if it was some of his own sperm.
You wanking off as a guy, and then swapping and doing it again as a girl.
Okay, so this happens because the next episode is the zombie episode, and the show's been setting up the Shannon thing and Seth's search for the power to bring her back from the dead, and that ties into the relationship with Kelly, and the only way we get any of the payoff to it all is if someone uses the power to bring Shannon back, since Seth can't use the powers while he has them. That all makes sense, writing-wise. It even makes sense that it's Curtis who Seth gives the power to. I'm on board with that happening, but it wouldn't happen through Seth approaching Curtis out of the blue, nor would Curtis keep it secret had Seth not done something for him. So Curtis needs to ask Seth for a favor. So basically, the only reason that this is here is so that Curtis has a reason to get rid of his power. And, like, it feels like the weirdest possible choice they could have made. Overman and Brown are both given story credits on this one, and just, guys, what was going on that this was what you landed on? Like, it's not bad, it's just baffling, and it only gets more baffling the more I think about it. Like, we saw Curtis as Mel get his period in episode 2, and now he's pregnant, but he was Curtis for most of the time since then, and only Mel for short bursts. Does Curtis's body have some kind of internal clock that means that when he switches to Mel, he's at the point in the menstrual cycle that he would be had he been Mel the whole time? Like, if he starts bleeding as Mel, and then turns back into Curtis for 2 weeks, and then turns into Mel again, he's presumably not still bleeding. He hasn't suspended the period for 2 weeks and resumed it now that he's Mel again. How does that work? I mean, I guess it's just kind of magic, but still, transforming presumably means that an egg that has been released from the ovary but not fertilized will just vanish into the ether if Curtis were to never turn back, but he can't do that with a fertilized embryo. What are the implications of that? Is his power anti-abortion? Does it believe life begins at conception, or is it just too much for it to process when he tries to switch? I'm kind of glad his power doesn't let him keep changing, because I feel like the alternative just raises more questions. But, as weird as all that is, none of it is the reason this section exists. There's really just one reason that this section exists, and I don't know how to say it delicately. Kelly fucks a gorilla. And look, this isn't going the direction you think it's going. I don't actually think there's anything wrong in the context established by the show with Kelly fucking a gorilla. Bruno passes the Jack Harkness test. It's all fine. No. My concern is that this show fucking drops the fact that gorillas are as much people as humans are and does nothing with it. Or, no, it does something with it, but that something is that one of them is sexually attracted to humans and then dates Kelly. Bruno is turned human by the storm because he'd seen human women at the zoo and wanted to date one. It's not that he was lonely and desired companionship, but that he wanted to be in a relationship with a human woman.
I used to see all these guys with their girlfriends. I had no one. I just wanted to find a beautiful girl and be with her and make her happy.
Once he is human, he's able to function reasonably well as one for a couple months, and between that, the way he communicates, and Kelly hearing his thoughts with her power, I'm comfortable saying that Bruno is a person. He is as intelligent as a human with the same degree of sentience. And it's not just because of the storm. After he's shot and turns back into a gorilla, his thoughts are as cogent and clearly communicated as before. Being turned human didn't give him anything he didn't have as a gorilla. It just made him a different species. So, in the world of Misfits, gorillas are fully sentient creatures who, given the opportunity, could fully participate in human society, including in engaging in romantic relationships with humans, and they are being kept in zoos. I don't know what to do with that. Heck, are dogs sentient in the Misfits world? I don't know anymore. Kelly is able to hear her dog's Keith's thoughts in the first episode, and they sound like a normal human way of expressing things, but it never comes up again. Like, I get that it's for the joke, but come on. Is it that Kelly's power interprets animal thoughts for her? That doesn't feel right, but the alternative is that dogs think in full sentences in English, and I don't know what to make of that.
Hey, Todd? What the fuck?
The worst part of the Bruno plotline is that if you back up from all the questions it brings up and fails to answer, you're still left with implications that I do not know how I'm supposed to feel about. The whole point of the Bruno storyline is that Kelly is able to finally find a guy who is sincere and who doesn't say something other than what he's thinking, and that is a refreshing change from life with her power.
Most people say one thing to your face and think something different. Bruno wasn't like that. Thought nice things about me.
Bruno doesn't judge her, he doesn't make negative assumptions about her sexuality, which Kelly's been having to deal with nigh constantly from nearly everyone. And the reason for all of that is that he is a gorilla. I don't know what that's supposed to say about Kelly. I don't know what that's supposed to say about men. I don't know what that's supposed to say about Kelly's power. It certainly feels like it's supposed to be saying something about most of those. I mean, it's Kelly's storyline, and it centers her power, and even though the stuff she generally hears applies to everyone, it does seem to be presented in a gendered way, if only because Kelly only dates men. Bruno's death gets sad violins playing in the background while Kelly cries and cradles him in her lap, so clearly the audience is meant to take it seriously, at least on some level, but I cannot for the life of me figure out what the takeaway is here. Kelly's power prevents her from ever experiencing connection with someone that isn't undercut by knowing what they're thinking. It is so ingrained in people to be judgmental and disingenuous that she has to literally look outside of her own species to find a partner who isn't those things. If that is what we're meant to understand, then the show basically ends up reinforcing it by having the only lasting romantic relationship she has in the show only start after she's gotten rid of her first power. If she'd kept it, would she and Seth still have gotten together, or would she hear all the stuff he was thinking and not be able to get past it? Kelly knows that there must be things he thinks that he never says, that perhaps some of those are the kind of things that would cause her to end the relationship if she still had her old power, and yet she has chosen ignorance. She got rid of her power, and as long as she doesn't have to directly be confronted with it, she can carry on as though the distance between what people think and what they say isn't there. Because if she doesn't do that, she might never have a close relationship again. Are intimacy and connection only possible because of deception? Because of the small ways we lie to each other in order to hide the unkind and judgmental thoughts we have? Perhaps we hide them out of selfishness, but perhaps we do so out of kindness, or even out of self-delusion, out of an aspiration to be the kind of person who doesn't think those things. If the people you loved actually knew everything that you'd ever thought about them, good and bad, would they still be able to love you? Would you still be able to love them if you had to hear every stray judgment, observation, and opinion that passed through their head when they looked at you? Would you be able to fully trust anything people said to you anymore if you knew with certainty how often people say things they don't really mean and smooth over what they think into a more palatable version? Or maybe Howard Overman just thought it would be edgy to have Kelly fuck an ape. At this point, who's to say?
Unit 4, Transmedia Storytelling. Lesson 1, Canon and Continuity.
The most 2009 thing about Misfits is the existence of transmedia storytelling content. No, actually, the most 2009 thing is the iPods. Look at their iPods! I love iPods. This video is dedicated to my first generation iPod Shuffle, Adobe 2005. Thanks for a record year. It still works and I love it dearly. But the second most 2009 thing, after the iPods, is the transmedia storytelling content, online exclusive content that exists within the world of the show and continues the narrative across more than one medium. For Misfits, this mostly took the form of in-character Twitter accounts and short webisodes that accompanied the early seasons. They're an interesting addition to the show, and there are actually some points where they're quite relevant to the story, but for the most part, the transmedia content exists in a weird place because it's not really something you can easily incorporate into watching the show unless you were keeping up with it as it came out. The webisodes are the easiest to include if you're watching today, and were, as far as I can tell, mostly hosted on E4's website at the time, though at least some of them were posted to the YouTube page that existed for Simon. A couple of those YouTube uploads are still there, but the only way to watch most of the webisodes is through versions that have been re-uploaded by fans. The in-character Twitter accounts are still there as far as I can tell, though in making this video I used a Tumblr blog that had gone through and archived them all through screenshots, so thanks to misfitstweets.tumblr.com for that. Simon's Flickr still exists, but Alisha's Tumblr has been deactivated and you can only see a couple things on it through the Wayback Machine. Because this whole method of providing bonus content and supplementary story material relies on your audience seeking it out on platforms other than the one they're using to watch the show, it's far less likely to actually hold anything important to the story or plot. A lot of web series will also have in-character accounts associated with them that provide additional information or perspectives on the events of the show, but the content that makes up the main story of those are also released online to begin with, so expecting your audience to be on another online platform and engaging with the story there isn't as big of an ask. And a couple of them have even rerun the transmedia content, re-releasing it in real time for fans who want to experience the story again, or who might have missed it the first time. Because of this, web series are far more likely to include things exclusively on characters' online accounts as a part of how they tell the story. Never so big that they'd cause plot holes for people just watching the videos, but I distinctly remember watching the Lizzie Bennet Diaries as it came out and getting information secondhand through the YouTube comments because I didn't have Twitter and I was missing stuff that wasn't in the videos or that was only fully explained on YouTube later on. With a show on broadcast television, though, you need your audience to be able to get a complete story solely through the episodes themselves. The webisodes occasionally depict things that are later mentioned in the events of the show, but with the exception of Vegas Baby, there's nothing important in them that isn't at some point communicated in an episode of the show. The in-character accounts are even more affected by that, since, well, you can re-watch an online video, but the timing of tweets and other posts online is part of how you interpret them, and the whole gimmick of the transmedia accounts only achieves its desired goal of increased immersion if you're engaging with them in real time. Reading them through after the fact just doesn't have the same effect. All this leads to the in-character accounts essentially boiling down to just a form of marketing, a pretty cool form of marketing, but marketing nonetheless, and a kind that fell by the wayside as time passed. Those same factors also lead to the online accounts existing in an odd place when it comes to what can be considered canon. Basically, the Twitter accounts cannot possibly be actual accounts that exist within the universe of Misfits. There are a couple reasons for this, but the big one is time. The tweets are posted as though the events of the show take place when the episodes air, including making reference to the current year, even when it cannot possibly be that year in universe, characters making reference to Guy Fawkes Day happening shortly before the start of community service when that doesn't remotely work with the information we get about the timing of the show, and retaining the spacing between the seasons airing. The other reason is the content of the tweets. This ranges from Kelly's account live tweeting the first episode with what is clearly her character's internal monologue, to them talking about their powers publicly when for the most part within the show they keep it quiet, to future Simon having a Twitter account. He's on a top secret dramatic time-traveling superhero mission. He would not fucking do that. That said, I think that the various in-character accounts do feature some interesting insights in terms of the characters, and I think the best way to view them is as a reflection of thoughts, feelings, or opinions that the characters would hold, rather than literal reflections of what the characters are tweeting in-universe. They are still largely inconsequential, but especially once the accounts start interacting with each other, you get interesting character moments that are enjoyable to see and are generally in keeping with the show. Sometimes there's a greater deviation, though, mostly in the form of placing more emphasis on the romantic relationships, particularly for the tweets published during Season 2. A lot of this is the more canon-divergent stuff, but again, if you treat it as reflective of the character's general feelings rather than literal events, it still works. Again, that goes back to what these accounts are primarily doing. They're increasing fan interest and engagement, and a lot of that ends up being about shipping. The function of transmedia storytelling is to build up the world so that audience members can be more fully immersed in it if they so choose, and so that they can form further relationships with the characters. And the online accounts, even if they don't fully fit into the narrative of the show, do that really effectively.
Unit 4, Transmedia Storytelling. Lesson 2, Diegesis and Immersion.
The reason that I refer to the transmedia content related to Misfits as one of the more 2009 things about the show is that it represents a specific way of building fan engagement with shows that has gone out of style, seemingly, with the rise of streaming. It's not specific to just 2009, but it seemed to sort of peter out around the mid-2010s, and the reason I attribute it to the rise in streaming platforms is that it relies heavily on the temporal relationship with shows airing at a specific time each week. The Misfits transmedia content and other transmedia content from around the same time, like Barney's blog for How I Met Your Mother, are specifically geared toward creating additional immersion in the world of the show, and that aspect in particular is what I think is the most specific to the mid to late aughts and early 2010s. As I alluded to when discussing the in-character Twitter accounts, it's much easier to use transmedia content to build immersion for shows that have a weekly time slot, or set days for videos to come out in the case of web series. And it doesn't have the same effect for shows where a season will drop all at once online, and then an audience can binge and watch it in one night if they choose. BoJack Horseman has an in-character Twitter account, but it's almost entirely unconnected from the events of the show, and largely for jokes. You can visit whattimeisitRightNow.com and SamanthaGhostRestaurants.tumblr.com, but they're very sparse, and again, more for the joke. BoJack Horseman is one of the few shows I can think of with that kind of thing, and it's nowhere near an in-character blog maintained by a writer for 9 years, or short videos filmed by the actual cast. I also think that even outside of the way that streaming has changed things, the trend of in-universe online content has just faded away as time passed in favor of other kinds of online extras, and you can watch this shift happen over the run of Misfits. The Season 1 webisodes are in-universe recordings made by Simon, but by Season 4 we have decidedly non-canon comedic recaps of the episodes, and by Season 5 it's gone completely. There is a change each season in how the webisodes are presented, and it has a direct impact on the immersion of the audience. The Season 1 webisodes are the ones which were posted to Simon's YouTube channel, and even if you haven't watched them, you've seen clips from them if you've seen Season 1, Episode 6, where they make up parts of the Nathan Memorial video Simon makes for Kelly. The videos are mostly casual or funny interactions between the characters with little to no bearing on the actual plot of the episodes, and mostly they provide characterization in a casual setting that you don't get in the episode plots. As a way of building immersion, they work really well paired with things like the character Twitter accounts and Simon's Flickr, because they make these characters feel that little bit more like real people. I've always liked that clips from them turn up in the parts of the Nathan Memorial reel that Kelly watches, because even if you haven't seen where they're from, they make the weeks that these characters spend together feel more real, because you're seeing things that have happened in these characters' lives outside of the main plot. The casual, no-stakes nature of the events of the webisodes also give the friendships between the characters more depth, and increase the audience's connection to the characters.
The shift when it comes to the diegetic nature of the webisodes starts with the 3 set between Seasons 1 and 2 when Nathan is in his coffin, which are not diegetic recordings in any way and are not presented as such. We, the audience, are just seeing them the way we'd see the events of the episodes. In Season 2, however, we go back to at least the appearance of in-universe recordings. They're presented as though they're taken from the security cameras in the community center, but if you think about it even a little bit, that doesn't hold up since a lot of the cameras are in places there's no reason for a camera to be. I saw a comment that suggested that future Simon placed the cameras to keep an eye on the rest of the group, but I don't think so. I think that the better explanation is that these are not diegetic recordings at all, but rather taking on the style of found footage in order to achieve a comparable immersive result to the Season 1 webisodes. If you treat them as diegetic recordings, it makes them less immersive, but if you don't think about it and just take it as an aesthetic choice, it's a lot more effective. What we're being told, through the choice to shoot it as found footage, is that this is what these characters do in their downtime. This is what candid recordings of them would look like. The flip side of this, though, is that it feels a little more like watching a fictional show than watching real people do things, because the characters are unaware they're being recorded, and the use of multiple camera angles means they use comparable editing language to movies and TV as a whole, instead of Simon's beginner YouTuber style. Not to mention that the events much more often tie into the events of the actual episodes, so it feels like they're continuing to build the narrative rather than honestly depicting the actions of bored 20-somethings. Season 2 still errs on the side of building immersion and giving fans more of the world to discover, but it's closer to just getting bonus scenes from the episodes rather than learning more about these characters as though they were real people in the world. I'm not saying that the Season 1 transmedia content was actually trying to convince people that these characters were real, obviously not. But there was a degree of verisimilitude to engaging with things that are supposedly posted online in-universe that changes how you approach the content. Season 3 only has 2 episodes, Vegas Baby and Eraser, both of which are basically just mini episodes of the show. They are devoid of any of the same interesting diegetics or stylistic choices featured in Season 1 and 2 episodes, so engaging with them feels like watching an episode of the show. I don't think this means the viewer isn't immersed watching these, I just think that the viewer is only as immersed as they were when watching the show itself, no more. The fact that these were released online doesn't change anything about how you engage with them. They're not making use of anything specific to the internet in any way, and it wouldn't be that odd to see them broadcast on TV. Whereas if Channel 4 broadcast one of Simon's videos of the gang, it would feel deeply out of place. That's a YouTube video. It belongs online.
Both Vegas Baby and Eraser are well made, but they're distinctly different from the transmedia content of earlier seasons, to the point that I'd argue they're not even aiming for the same effect. Earlier content was a way of appealing to the target audience by using the internet the way they used it, by reflecting the role of the social internet in the daily lives of young adults, and by taking advantage of the growing online landscape of fandom. If someone is going to be online talking about a show anyway, finding a lot of additional official content, particularly interactive content, is a great incentive to talk about it more. That sounds cynical, and yes, the in-character Twitters were, as I said, essentially a form of marketing, but they're also fun. They're a way of getting fan activity and fandom started. I didn't watch Misfits as it was coming out. I found it on Netflix in 2013, but even then, there was something exciting about finding Simon's videos on YouTube, and the times when I've watched web series as they came out and actually followed characters in character accounts has been engaging in a way unique to that form, and created a relationship with the story that made following it a lot of fun. Also, these characters would be on Twitter. Simon would be posting his video projects online. This is a realistic reflection of what their online presence would be in 2009. Misfits, on a thematic level, is concerned with the lives of young adults at the time it was made and what it feels like to be a young person entering your 20s. By giving these characters online accounts that can be seen in the real world, you're characterizing them in a way that makes them feel more complete to the target audience and more effectively grounds them in just what the show was going for, in depicting the messy, raucous parts of young adulthood.
Unit 5, The Kids Today. Lesson 1, Youth as Youth Sees It.
In his 1930 introduction to Romeo and Juliet, Harley Granville-Barker describes the play by saying, "This is a tragedy of youth as youth sees it, and age is not let play a very distinguished part." He goes on to describe various key characters in the work, pointing out specifically the relationship between the characters' age and how they are depicted, illustrating that much of the play's strength rests on the constructed dichotomy between young and old. The adult characters are not honest depictions of the people their ages they realistically are. Lady Caplet's lines in the first folio are frequently attributed to old lady, despite her being 28 if you do the math. But rather, they are adults as seen by the young. Romeo and Juliet must feel misunderstood and disregarded by the adults around them, even the ones sympathetic to their problems, in order for the urgency they feel and the lack of trust in their feuding parents to hold the weight it does and to feel real to the audience. To the common criticism that they're just dumb teenagers, my response is yes, they are. They're just dumb teenagers, but they have not had the chance yet to be anything else, and that does not make their tragedy any less real. No, it is what facilitates their tragedy at all. Their tragedy is the tragedy of being young in a world where that means you have no sway, of the joys and pains of adolescence as experienced in the moment, of a story which is cut short before you really got going.
The main characters of Misfits are all young offenders, emphasis on the young. The 5 main actors were all between the ages of 19 and 24 at the time Season 1 was released, and their characters are probably about the same ages. I'm inclined to believe that Ewan Rayan is playing a little younger than his actual age, closer to 19 or 20, based on the way he talks about secondary school and just general vibes. But otherwise, I see the characters as the same ages as their actors. In at least 2 interviews, Howard Overman refers to the characters as teenagers, so maybe when writing it he was thinking of them all as 18 and 19, since they're all clearly adults, none of them are still in secondary school, but in the show as aired, there's more range. Either way, they're young. Nathan, Simon, and Kelly haven't done any post-secondary education. Alisha has, and Curtis may have, depending on if he was also going to school during his racing career or not. Most of the group start the show living with their parents. They are young, and the show puts their youth at the forefront, especially in the first 2 seasons, and presents the ways in which they are looked down on and dismissed for their age and the behaviors that go along with being young and reckless. There are a lot of small choices that go into depicting youth culture honestly without making that big of a deal of it most of the time. None of the actors' tattoos are covered up, for instance, and whether this is a deliberate choice or just the product of a limited makeup budget, the result is that some of these characters just have tattoos without it being something worth commenting on. I don't know if all of the character tattoos are ones that the actors also have, but at least some are. That doesn't feel as noteworthy now. I feel like judgment around having tattoos has lessened, but for 2009, it feels worth pointing out. The show also takes on a neutral framing when it comes to depicting drug use. A lot of the characters smoke pot. Sometimes they take party drugs. There is little to no judgment around it when they do. There are some discussions of drugs in a negative context, such as Shannon's overdose or Curtis getting community service for possessing cocaine. Curtis gets a harsher sentence because he's a very publicly visible black man and the cops want to send a message about drug use, which is a reflection of the reality that black people are punished more harshly when it comes to drugs, among many other things.
If it was anyone else, they'd have got a caution. I get 200 hours community service and a 2-year ban from athletics. They said, because of my profile, they needed to send a message.
But aside from being sympathetic to Curtis, there is no statement made on that reality. The fact that Seth's power is the result of having been a drug dealer, paired with Shannon's overdose and Kelly pointing out the immorality of his power dealing, does draw the connection between dealing powers and dealing drugs as both being negative, but the show leaves it as an implied connection between two different forms of supplying people with something potentially dangerous without any effort to ensure their safety. I don't think that Misfits is making a political statement with this choice. I think that it has political implications, but it's not like the show is advocating for better care for addicts or for specific forms of harm reduction. The most it's saying is that drugs exist, and many people, mostly young people, do them recreationally. And that statement is more of the point than taking a stance on when or if drug use is okay. The show is interested in portraying these characters behaving the way a lot of young people behave, so we see them drink and party and do drugs and have casual sex without explicitly moralizing it in any particular direction. The other main aspect of reflecting the age of our characters in how the story is told is the role of probation workers in the story and how they treat our main characters. All of the probation workers suck, except maybe this one, she dies too soon to say. The specifics vary, but Tony, Sally, and Sean are all dismissive of the main characters and largely disinterested in actually doing the work of helping them move forward and giving them options to help rehabilitate. Tony, even before the storm messes him up, kind of acts like he resents that he has to be around young offenders.
Painting benches. How'd you screw that up? You tell me, because I've got no idea.
Sean doesn't care about his job even a little, which is great for when you want your characters to be able to run around engaging with your increasingly complicated episode plots, but as a probation worker means that he does fuck all to actually help the group, which is called out directly by the characters.
Sometimes I wonder if you take this job entirely seriously.
I'm 100% committed to your ongoing rehabilitation. It occupies my every waking minute.
I've already covered most of my main issues with Sally, but I think she's interesting to look at because she gives us the closest example of what a good probation worker could be. In episode 5, Sally has interviews with the characters about their experiences with community service, and in Simon's, she speaks to him about his goals for after the community service ends, and possibly setting him up with some work experience. If she weren't just doing this to manipulate Simon and get closer to him, it would look like doing a decent job at being a probation worker. She still wouldn't be great, but she'd be okay. Of course, she's the season's villain, and even before she starts manipulating Simon, there's also her deep-seated conviction that the gang is responsible for Tony's disappearance, or at least know something about it. She's right, but it's based on very little, and it seems rooted in her inherent suspicion of the group because of their status as young offenders. That is, of course, central to all the failings of their probation workers. It's not just the probation workers dismiss the group because of their youth and the behaviors which the show attaches to that, it's that they dismiss our main characters because of their criminal records. If you'll recall, way back in section 1, part of the narrative importance of the group being in community service is that they are constantly discredited and disregarded by the people around them, particularly authority figures. Due to the bulk of the show being set during the group's community service, the majority of those authority figures are in some way involved in the penal system, and I want to take the time to more closely examine that aspect of how Misfits depicts the relationship between people charged with crimes and those given the task of rehabilitating them. Once again, the show isn't really making a big point with this, it's using it to center the experiences and perspectives of the main characters, but this gets closer to saying something about the justice and penal systems than the rest of the stuff we've covered in this section. Namely, that said systems are at best indifferent to the people within them and at worst actively disregarding their well-being. There are surprisingly few depictions of cops. The only one with significant screen time is the detective from season 1 who appears in one episode of season 2, but when they do occur, they are generally negative.
I love the police.
The cop following up on Alisha breaking her curfew kind of sucks even before he's affected by her power. The officers chasing down Bruno end up shooting him excessively with little provocation, and the detective investigating Tony's disappearance is also the one who arrested Curtis. That detective, given the name Pete by the credits, does actually get some nuance. He's trying to rein in Sally's suspicions, and given that he is also black, his motivations when arresting Curtis aren't quite as straightforward as anti-black racism would be coming from a white officer. The way he explains it, he seems disappointed in Curtis for not being a good enough role model as a public figure who is black.
You don't need to be getting involved in this kind of thing. Not with your profile. Think, yeah? Sort yourself out.
His actions still suck, and he is not solely responsible for Curtis's harsher sentence, but I feel like if I didn't talk about that scene, I would be oversimplifying things earlier in my discussion of Curtis's arrest and sentencing. Even if Pete gets some nuance, though, the overall portrait of police is an unflattering one. The police all suck, the probation workers don't care and don't want to help you rehabilitate. You're just living your life and everyone thinks you're a screw-up.
The culmination of all of this is Season 1, Episode 6, or as I call it, the Virtue Cult episode. Season 1 of Misfits is making a very clear argument over the course of its 6 episodes. Season 1 is the most thematically focused of any single season of the show, that theme being young people are everything people say they are. They are, in fact, drinking too much and doing drugs and making poor decisions, but that does not make them bad people, and in fact, it should be celebrated. That argument continues to an extent in Season 2, though it's more of an undercurrent than the main focus. It still gets attention in some episodes, and is highlighted at the end of Season 2, Episode 6, with a speech from Nathan that is as much a reiteration of its themes as a concluding statement on them. With Season 3, as the story's focus shifts, it is increasingly less concerned with accurately depicting the worldview of young people. It's not totally irrelevant. For instance, it's highlighted in this line from Rudy.
We just want you to know that this isn't our fault. We're in the wrong place at the wrong time. A lot. We're really not bad kids. I know.
But it no longer feels like it expresses the core of the show the way Nathan's season's ending speeches do. As the story has naturally evolved to looking at other aspects of the superhero genre to critique, the focus has shifted away from the core themes of Season 1 and 2, another reason it would be better served by losing the community service setting.
The Virtue Cult episode centers on the fear of assimilation and loss of identity, of your values shifting so much that you are subsumed into a cultural homogeny that does not represent you as you think of yourself now. The form this takes in the episode is Rachel, who is religious and morally opposed to drug use, casual sex, and any number of other behaviors in which her peers are engaging. Her power lets her brainwash people into adopting her worldview, after which they reform themselves, according to her ideas of reformation, and help her recruit new people to the cause.
You don't need to behave like this. You can be so much better.
This is played a lot like a body snatcher kind of story, and by treating the supposedly positive changes as a source of fear and horror, the episode really effectively ties in both the show's stance on the way young people act and the fact that authority figures don't take the kids seriously.
Who are we gonna tell? This is every policeman and parent's wet dream.
According to the values of the society in which Misfits was made, and in which its assumed audience resides, a lot of this is positive, though most of it only to conservative mindsets.
We're campaigning against contraceptives being given out in schools. You sign it.
This is the closest the show ever gets to being deliberately political. By positioning itself in opposition to the values of the Virtue Cult, it implicitly supports things like better access to contraceptives and sex-positive attitudes. However, even more left-leaning people are likely to see some of the changes as positive. The kids are doing something with themselves. They're thinking about university. What's not to like? The show uses the brainwashing and subsequent lack of agency caused by Rachel's power to reflect a real fear. You could become the people who are currently looking down on you, the adults who roll their eyes at your choices and tell you you're messing up your life. You might watch that happen to your friends, watch them become people you barely recognize and whom you swore you would never be. And it might happen to you, and you'd be happy about the change. This episode is about the loss of youth culture among young people, and consequently comes down in support and celebration of that culture, but it is also very much about the fear of growing up and becoming a person you don't recognize, with values that seem anathema to how you currently see the world. Because the viewpoint of this episode is so rooted in a fear held by teenagers and 20-somethings, it reinforces the way the entire show positions itself from the perspective of that age group. The portrait this episode creates of adulthood is deliberately monolithic. It doesn't reflect the actual realistic nuance of the variety of perspectives and values that older adults hold. It depicts the way young people see adulthood as a whole when confronted with the ways society is dismissive of younger people because of their youth. Individual adults over 25 are almost entirely absent from this episode, but the specter of adulthood as a concept, of societal norms of maturity and respectability, hangs over the characters throughout. If the episode's premise hinges on exploring a fear of changing to the point that you become the people looking down on you, then the natural response to that is Nathan Young, the embodiment of saying, "Fuck you, I'm gonna be this way forever," to people who tell you that you're young and your opinions will change. Going up against the virtue cult after everyone else has either been caught or gone into hiding, Nathan delivers a speech.
She's got you thinking this is how you're supposed to be. Well, it's not!
The speech really is an encapsulation of the entire outlook of the show. It's not actually heroic or inspiring, it's a little bit cynical, and it's honest about the fact that things aren't all that great. But it still manages to feel optimistic, to celebrate the fact of being a screw-up, of being young and reckless in a way that means you get looked down on by the world at large.
We had it all. We fucked up bigger and better than any generation that came before us. We were so beautiful!
This episode, and Season 1 as a whole, are structured to center Nathan's character both in how the story is told and the themes it is exploring, setting this episode up as one that needs to center him over the other characters because of who he is, his resistance to change and growth, his deliberate and insistent immaturity. Nathan gets a parallel speech in Season 2, Episode 6. This one is less a celebration of being a screw-up and more a direct reflection of the position the characters are in as young people who have just finished community service.
What are we gonna do tomorrow? Or the day after that, huh? We have just been shat out onto a huge pool of piss with all the other long-term unemployable.
It also features a direct connection to the superpower element of the show in a way that his Season 1 speech did not. Namely, the show's position that superpowers don't actually do much to improve your life when it comes to most real-world concerns.
Okay, so I'm immortal, but other than that, I've basically got fuck all going for me.
The show, as a whole, and particularly the first two seasons, exists somewhere between the two speeches, between "we were so beautiful" and "okay, so I'm immortal, but other than that, I got fuck all going for me," and within the shared irreverence and flippant cynicism that the two share. Misfits, at its best, is a darkly funny and surprisingly honest depiction of the aimlessness and freedom of being in your early 20s, which uses its speculative elements to effectively and meaningfully explore its characters and strengthen its themes. Superheroes are supposed to be, well, heroic, to put other people first and to help those around them, to serve, you might say, the community. But the kind of community service our main characters are doing kind of sucks. It's not punching a supervillain and saving the day, it's picking up litter. Getting superpowers won't change your life or solve your problems. It might just cause new ones. Being young means that people don't take you seriously, and more often than not, you're going to be ignored or let to fall through the cracks. You're a screw-up. I'm a screw-up. But you know what? You can embrace that. Go out there and mess things up with confidence, or, at the very least, get some friends together and try to have a good time.
What's happened to the kids today? I don't know what's happened to the kids today. I don't know what's happened to the kids today. I don't know